Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, there were no signs on the horizon that this day for me would be any different to the next, much like the devastating day when the Twin Towers came crumbling down in New York City. By all accounts, the day started like any other, as the people bustled happily around the city, making their way to work, picking up their regular cup of coffee from the cafe and a donut from their favourite bakers, as they sauntered off to work, never perceiving for a moment that New York City was hanging by a hair's breadth on the precipice of a looming catastrophic disaster, when something calamitous would happen that would invariably shake the world to its core, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. In the dreadful, direful, woeful aftermath, many of us lamenting Americans began to taste the pernicious, repugnant, vile flavour of evil as we watched the spiralling smoke billow out the rubble of what remained of the two great towering landmarks of the southwestern tip of Manhattan near the Hudson River, a few blocks northwest of Wall Street in New York City, the familiar imposing silhouettes that would never grace the skyline again. Some would swear that within the smoke itself they saw the iniquitous shapes and faces of demons, and when I myself viewed the ungodly footage, I could not dispute their claims. It was like that for me, a benign, regular day that seemed as normal as any other, but for me this day would end up being a Twin Tower event on a personal level that would shatter me to my very foundations. The frail, slender scaffolding of my human body would similarly come crumbling down in a pathetic, towering heap, much like the Twin Towers had done. Soon I would become blazingly aware that there is evil living among us, surreptitiously hiding in the dark shadows, trying to appear innocuous, temperate, and invisible, but in truth it is anything but. Just because you cannot see it does not mean it is not there. Sometimes this evil rises like the billowing smoke of the Twin Towers and latches on to the unsuspecting stranger, seizing them unaware with her duplicitous cunning until you're crying out for help as she presses you down with her suffocating arms, desperately trying to squeeze the breath out of your lungs so that death may become the victor and you the unsuspecting victim. Well, that is what it was like for me on the day when my intuition had been so easily fleeced. I had been oblivious to the impending danger that would unhesitantly overtake me on the wind like an owl swooping down to grab an unwary mouse, in the blinking of an eye, for that is all it takes. I remember the routine regularities of that normal day with a haunting, airy clarity, because like any day embroiled with a disaster, even those minor, insignificant details, like what I had for breakfast that morning, never become washed away or faded by the passing of time, like a dark pair of blue jeans that fades beyond recognition after 100 washes in the washing machine, so that it looks like a completely different item of clothing, not bad or good, just conspicuously different. I do remember getting up slightly late that morning, as my alarm had failed to shatter the silence with its offensive, loud, blaring noise. I had invested in the worst kind of alarm, so that it would thoroughly annoy me, so much so that I'd be forced to get out of bed to shut the bloody thing up. Excuse the bad language. Suffice to say, the alarm did not go off this morning, something that had never happened to me before. Maybe it was the universe trying to suggest I didn't leave the confines of my bed this morning, sending me that suggestive warning nudge that I foolishly chose to ignore. More fool me. But you know what they say, there's no fool like an old fool. I had left a crack in my bedroom curtain, and so a bright beam of sunlight burst into my bedroom like an annoying headlight, staring you blindly in the face. It was this invasive, intrusive sunlight searing over my face, causing me to squint uncomfortably as the heat of the sun burnt my eyelids. It was that uncomfortable, blinding, mid-morning sun that made me glance at the clock. I gasped in horror. I was 2 hours late for work. How had this happened? I was supposed to be in the offices by 9, and it was 11 already. I was running very, very late. Hastily I jumped out of my bed, faster than a Jack Marsh hare, and dashed hurriedly towards the wardrobe, throwing on my clothes as fast as I could, knowing that being late for work would not earn me any brownie points with the boss. My large cat Bella looked up at me through her yellow eyes, as if wondering what all the fuss was all about. "I'm running late, Bella," I told her. "Don't look at me like that. If I lose my job, bang goes your favourite cat food," I threatened. My mellow, lackadaisical cat did not look desperately impressed with me. She stretched her paw out across the duvet and closed both her eyes, continuing to sleep. I ran briskly to the bedroom mirror, glancing at my dreadful reflection. My brown hair hung around my face in what looked like limp, twisted knots, and one end of my hair was standing on edge rather like a hedgehog. I quickly brushed it down so that my straight hair began to resemble its normal bob. I quickly threw on a touch of lipstick and mascara and ran out of the house faster than I've ever done before. Needless to say, when I arrived at work, my boss, Marcus Farrow, did not hesitate to give me some reproachful, reproving looks, but he never had the guts to ask me to my face why I was late. But let's just say, if looks could kill, he was wearing those looks, as his boot face looked exceedingly captious. I work for a web designer company, so I quickly got down to my computer and began to work trying to make amends for my lack of punctuality, bypassing the blueberry muffin and the coffee I would normally have enjoyed to give me that quintessential buzz, so that by lunchtime my energy was rarely flagging. Me and my friends sat under an oak tree together at the local park during lunch break, enjoying our sandwiches and watching a cute little squirrel scurrying up a tree branch, eyeing us both with bright brown eyes. The park was filled with the usual dog walkers taking their dogs for a leisurely stroll, and people sitting on park benches eating their lunches and breathing in the fresh, crisp air. For many locals working in a big bustling city like New York, they're always looking for an escapism, so many gravitate towards the park to be soothed and caressed reassuringly by the natural world. It was so cool in the park on this day, with its sumptuous acres of viridescent green grass, blue sky, along with a plethora of trees that were scattered liberally across this resplendent oasis. A wonderful respite from the beige blandness of the office, with its dull, poky, officey decor, drab wooden desks, uninspiring-looking computers, metal filing cabinets, not exactly riveting scenery, shall we say, without putting too fine a point on it. "You were a hell of a late this morning," said my friend Amanda, taking a large bite of her tuna mayo sandwich. "I couldn't help noticing the dirty looks Mr. Farrow was giving you." "Tell me about that," I said. I could feel his eyes drilling through my back. I think it would be infinitely better if he'd just shout at me. Unfortunately, my alarm clock didn't go off this morning. Amanda rolled her eyes. "You better be on time for court next week. You know you can't be late for that." "I know," I sighed. "I'll have to check my alarm when I get home to see why it didn't go off, or there'll be hell to pay, especially if I'm late again for work tomorrow. That, or I'll get Lydia to wake me up, as we're going to court together." "Might be a good idea," said Amanda. We were both witnesses in a court case we were attending next week. Me and my friend Lydia, who shares an apartment with me, had been viewing another apartment in a different area. We had to confirm the identity of the man that we'd seen running away from a woman he'd attacked on a New York sidewalk. We had to prove that he was the man we'd witnessed running away from the scene with a bloody knife in his hand and blood spatter all over his shirt. He was being charged for attempted murder and grievous bodily assault. I'll never forget his face as I stared into his enraged eyes as he ran away from the scene. Me and my friend Lydia, who worked in the same offices and of course shared the same apartment, both knew we would never forget his face as long as we lived. It was seared in our brain like an indelible tattoo that could never ever be erased. He was a young man in his early 20s with a hard face, with a very distinctive jagged scar running down the side of his cheek that I've never seen before in another person, so it hadn't been terribly difficult to identify the man in a lineup. Needless to say, Lydia had also picked out the very same man, so the police were fully satisfied that he was indeed the violent attacker of this poor unsuspecting woman. It would seem that me and Lydia were regarded as the two vital witnesses for the prosecution. Ostensibly, the thug who assaulted the victim didn't know who the witnesses were, as on the day in question we so happened to be walking down an unfamiliar street. Thankfully, we weren't local to the area, so we didn't have to go under some kind of witness protection. Even so, I wasn't looking forward to testifying against this morose, uncouth individual. I had been the one that had called 911 that day. Fortunately, favour shined down on the poor girl when we rescued her from her attacker. We had found her lying there in a crumpled heap on the ground. In the end, she did not die from her injuries, as the knife that was thrust into her chest missed her main artery. She was one lucky lady. I told him he could take my bag, she told us, but he still stabbed me, in what I assumed was her dying breath, as she lay there bleeding, lying in a pool of her own blood. The poor girl had drifted into unconsciousness after she'd said those final ominous words. I thought she would be dead before the emergency services arrived and rushed her off to hospital. It was hauntingly surreal, as we watched the efficient EMTs placing the bedraggled form of the victim on a gurney, throwing her faster than greased lightning into the back of the ambulance. I remember there was just so much blood. The air was filled with the pungent smell of copper. I could even taste it on my tongue. I remember the earnest, knowing glances of the EMTs as they exchanged ominous looks, and from their resigned expressions, Lydia and I deduced that this wasn't going to end well for the young girl. She had lost way too much blood, but arriving at the hospital with the prompt efficiency of the standby team and extra blood available, she made a full miraculous recovery, although I was in no doubt that the emotional injuries would take a whole lot longer to heal for her. I had learnt that she was undergoing trauma counselling, and I wasn't at all surprised. As we continued eating our lunch at the park, Amanda questioned me about how I felt about standing in as a witness for next week under the cross-examination of a judge in a courtroom. I haven't really given the matter much thought, I said, but now you're asking me this question, I'm beginning to feel somewhat unhinged. I imagine it'll be exactly like the courtroom scenes you see on television when they cross-examine the witness. The defence might try and undermine your testimony. What do you mean? Amanda put on a man's voice and pretended to be the defence. I put it to you, Miss Anderson, that you think you saw my client attack this woman, but I am very sure you must be mistaken. Well, I said, I'll insist I remember the jagged scar on the side of his cheek, and his piercing blue eyes. I don't mean to scare you, said Amanda, but I just need to warn you these defence lawyers can get terribly nasty, and when I say nasty, I mean vindictively nasty, so you need to watch your back and make sure you don't allow the man to intimidate you too much. The whole object is for him to make the jury doubt your testimony. He may even try and undermine you as a person, so that the jury will doubt your credibility. They're very good at doing that. Well, I don't see how he can do that. I've never broken the law or been arrested for being intoxicated, so I'm not exactly the defence's best friend. Even so, they have their ways of discrediting a prosecution witness and subverting their character, so you must watch out for that. How does Lydia feel about testifying? Well, she's not feeling good about it at all. She thinks we should have undergone witness protection anyway, but we weren't local to the area, and I very much doubt the man would even remember what we looked like, or even where we live. Oh, I wouldn't be sure about that, said Amanda. You can never be too careful. You both need to watch your backs, and I mean that. Well, Lydia's got a bee in her bonnet about it. She's convinced she's being stalked. Amanda grimaced. That is not good. I don't think Lydia would imagine that, surely. I think you can sense if someone's following you. You have a sixth sense about things like that. In the circumstances, you would be well advised to go to the police to express your concerns. If Lydia feels she's been stalked, they'll take the two of you very seriously and immediately put you under witness protection. I think they should have done so anyway. You can never be too careful these days. Some of those criminal types have these guileful ways of shutting up witnesses. So from the sounds of things, you really both need to tread very carefully. I'll discuss it with her tonight when we walk home together to our apartment. Sounds like a jolly good idea to me, said Amanda. I must confess I hadn't given the court case much thought, but after Amanda's inauspicious, somewhat baleful warnings about Lydia potentially being followed, I was beginning to feel rather concerned. It was late in the afternoon when we were both walking home together to our New York apartment. I began to tell her all about what Amanda had told me. She doesn't think you're imagining things, I told her. She believes if you sense you're being followed, then it's very likely to be true. Lydia looked at me gratefully. So you believe me now too, she said, her blue eyes growing earnest. I promise you, at lunchtime today when I went to that local cafe I usually go to for lunch, I saw a man with a hoodie. He kept a distance behind me, but he followed me into the cafe. And when I went to sit down at a table, I could see him in my peripheral vision, and he was watching me. He really creeped me out. But when I turned around to look directly at him, he looked another way. He was talking on his cell phone while he was looking at me. It was like he was up to no good. I had chills in my bones. What did he look like? I asked. Well, I couldn't see him. I mean, it was a fine day and he was wearing a hoodie. I mean, who does that? Someone who doesn't want to be noticed, I said. Are you kidding me? Laughed Lydia. What could possibly be more conspicuous than wearing a hoodie on a bright sunny day, I ask you? I even heard one man saying to him, What's your problem, bro? Are you living on another planet? It's a sauna outside and you're wearing a hoodie. What did he say? He said, Piss off, you wanker. The man responded in kind and said, Ditto to you too. Sounds like a nasty piece of work, I said. What horrible, nasty language to use. What you're saying to me, Lydia, is very unsettling. We need to go to the police to report this chap, whoever he is. It was late afternoon, but was still bright, cheerful and sunny on the street that was prettily lined with tall, statuesque oak trees that were swaying their boughs in a soft afternoon breeze. Then it happened. A powerful off-road vehicle with hefty tyres accelerated his engine. I could hear the brrr sound. It bypassed the asphalt road, plunging onto the pavement, heading directly towards us. There was no escape, except for us to back into the red brick wall. Then the mysterious vehicle, with its powerful thick rubber tyres, crushed everything in its wake, went thrusting right through us. The entire brick wall came tumbling down into a heap of crumpled bricks. I remember screaming, "Oh God, please no!" And then I recall nothing after that, apart from faint cries, ambulance sirens, and hearing a doctor in accident and emergency asking him if I could hear him. I tried to nod, but I couldn't. A year later, after this harrowing ordeal, my life had irredeemably and irrevocably changed. The ill-fated accident had severely impacted my life, and not in a good way either. I had suffered many broken bones, a bad concussion in the accident, as well as traumatic head injury that terminally, irreversibly perforated and damaged my eardrums, and blood flow to the cochlea had also been thwarted. Then there were small bones in the middle ear that had been severely damaged, as well as abrupt changes in the sequence and flow of air pressure in my ears. Suffice to say, I'd walked away deaf in both ears, and now had to live my life as a deaf person. I also suffered from frequent dizzy spells and issues with balance. As for Lydia, she didn't get away so easily, as she died on impact. We couldn't prove anything, but it was expediently convenient that a powerful off-road vehicle plunged through 2 witnesses for the prosecution that would be testifying in court the following week. The vehicle had simply failed to stop, driving away into the late afternoon as if nothing had happened, much like a hit and run. It would seem local witnesses had reported a dark, powerful vehicle with massive tyres and blacked-out windows literally accelerating off the road onto the pavement, plunging right into the 2 of us with a forceful impact, and then absconding from the scene faster than greased lightning. It was definitely deliberate, the witnesses had explained. It didn't look like an accident. I was convinced that we had been mown down by thugs who were determined we would not be able to testify in the trial the following week. Without any real witnesses coming forward, the man who stabbed that poor woman with the full intention of murdering her had got away with his insidious crime. I was to learn he had run off with her purse, containing $2,000 in cash, which he had taken out of a bank ATM only moments before. I think he must have been witness to this transaction, and was determined to mug her as a result. I was certain Lydia was absolutely right. She had been followed. None of this would have happened if we had been under police protection. My life was filled with so many regrets and what-ifs, but my trauma counsellor had advised me that I couldn't punish myself for what had happened. Tanya, she had said to me, looking at me with a stern expression on her face, I hear this all the time from my clients. If only I had done this and not that. If only I had listened or paid attention. If only I hadn't reacted so impulsively. If only I had this. If only I had that. I hear all my clients use the if only word as if it's seared on their soul in blue ink. Now, Lydia, if only is a very negative word. How is it ever going to help you? You have to accept what's happened and move on with your life. Acceptance is key. For if you fail to accept, you'll be stuck in a bubble of depression that will rob you of embracing life with both of your hands. You're alive, and that certainly is something to celebrate. Yes, you're deaf, but it could have been a whole lot worse. Instead of looking at a cup half full, embrace the positives. You're alive, you're healthy, you're well, you can see, smell and touch. Those are positive things worthy of celebration and gratitude.
It's all right for you, I protested. You can't imagine what it's like to be deaf. My entire life has been turned upside down and back to front. I don't hear a thing anymore. The only thing that wakes me up in the morning is a vibrating alarm clock that flashes like an ambulance light. I've had to learn sign language and to read people's lips, and that's terribly difficult. But my whole world is so quiet now. You can't imagine what life is like in a soundless world. Sometimes I just want to scream. Good, Tonya. I'm glad you're finally expressing your feelings. That's terribly important. You definitely need to vent your anger. Release all your frustration. But you must accept that you're deaf now. I can imagine it's a huge adjustment to have to make. It can't be easy living in a soundless world. But there's no reason why you cannot have a very good and full life. Many deaf people are very happy indeed. Well, I lost my job as a web designer. Now that wasn't fair. Mr. Farrow, my boss, said I had to speak to my clients on the telephone, and if I couldn't hear what they had to say, there was no way I could keep my job. Yes, I agree. It is an unfair world. We live in an all-seeing, hearing world that doesn't necessarily accommodate the hard of hearing or the hard of seeing. But I promise you this, there are jobs out there for you, and companies that are actively encouraged to hire those with physical impediments like yours. Now, I want you to know, Tonya, that I'm very pleased with your progress to date. But the next part of your therapy is to go away on your own for a couple of weeks into the countryside. And when I say away on your own, I mean on your own. You can't have anyone with you. This is a time you've got to spend with yourself. But why? What good would that do? It's a whole lot of good for you, Tonya. I find when my clients go away for a couple of weeks on their own to the countryside, or to the Oregon coast, the choice is yours. They come back transformed, regenerated, and so much more positive about their lives. I want you to take long walks in nature, study a butterfly darting from one flower to another, run your hands down the bark of a tree, smell a rose, watch a bird tweeting on a branch, allow the soft sunshine to warm your back, soak in the beautiful views. I still don't get why you think it would be a good idea for me to go out into the natural world. Because I do, said my trauma counsellor. I want you to trust me on this, Tonya. I'm of the firm opinion that the natural world is the greatest healer of all. She works on us in a unique way. She'll give you exactly what you need, no more, no less. Then you'll come back inspired. You will resume your therapy. But nature can do so much more for you than I ever will be able to. I've seen some of my clients almost suicidal, eager to give up on their lives. And when they resume their counselling with me after being out in the natural world, their attitude completely shifts. They have a skip in their step and an upbeat attitude, and that is going to happen to you. But where will I go?
That's for you to decide, said my counsellor. I liked her because her lips were so easy to read. She didn't overcompensate with her lips that some people were inclined to do when they learnt I was deaf. Why don't you go online? See if you can find a location that tickles your fancy. That's your homework tonight. I'll see you when you get back, Tonya. Have a fabulous trip, she said. And that was that. Hence I was now in the resort town of Banff, which is in Alberta, Canada, located in the Banff National Park. It is the stupendous mountainous peaks of Mount Rundle and Mount Cascade, part of the Rocky Mountains that dominate the skyline. I was standing on Banff Avenue, which is the main thoroughfare, where there are boutiques, restaurants, chateau-style hotels, souvenir shops, and so much more. The vast area of parkland is home to a wonderful mix of wildlife, from elk to grizzly bears, and the list goes on and on. I had decided to come here based on all the pictures I'd seen online that had hijacked my attention with a wondrous awe, for the aquamarine lakes, hot springs, and intoxicating mountain scenery rarely held my appeal. I was here in Banff shopping for essential supplies, after which I'd booked myself into a remote wooden cabin. I was already feeling butterflies of excitement in my stomach that were flapping around my belly. I marvelled at the exquisite transfixing views of this marvellous place. One thing I'd noticed about becoming deaf is that my senses had sharpened immeasurably, as if to compensate for the shortcomings of my hearing impediment. My sense of smell had become extraordinarily pronounced and very sharp, so that the delicious smells of cinnamon buns that wafted down the street were so pronounced I literally followed them all the way to the bakery, and I couldn't resist buying half a dozen cinnamon buns. I could smell the flowers in the window boxes before I'd even seen them. Before I was deaf, I don't think I would have noticed them at all. The town of Banff was exquisite, a rarely beguiling mountain town that is postcard perfect, the kind of place you see on boxes of Swiss chocolates. It's just that beautiful, with the shallow-style shops, the huge colourful window boxes on the edge of the pavements full of spring flowers, the interesting eclectic shops, and those arresting mountain views set against a cobalt blue sky. There's only one word to describe it, and that is breathtaking. I was beginning to comprehend why my trauma counsellor had sent me to the countryside. I was feeling much more positive about my life. I had even brought myself a pretty summer dress from one of the boutiques, soft flowing, loose fitting. The shop assistant had told me that I looked $1 million. I love loose clothes on slender people like you, she said. You look absolutely terrific, and the white cotton looks fabulous with your dark hair. Has anyone told you that you bear a striking, remarkable resemblance to the Duchess of Cambridge, Prince William's wife? Only you're a lot prettier and your hair shorter. Thanks, I said, my face beaming with the compliment. I mean, who doesn't like being compared with the princess? Although I was pretty much against the establishment and the monarchy, as every country belongs to its people. It's the job of the establishment or the elected presidential party to do the will of the people, not the other way round. Sometimes many of the people in power seem to quickly forget that. I was soon buying some groceries at the store, and I waited for my taxi to collect me. Thankfully, he was right on time. The kind, very attentive taxi driver had helped me collect all my shopping and the baggage that I'd left in a public locker and put it into the back of his trunk. Then there we were, out on the open road, well on my merry way to the mysterious cabin I'd booked. I understand you became recently deaf, said the taxi driver, when his car had reached a stop sign so he could turn around for me to read his lips. What is life like living in a world without sound, I wonder? I was impressed, as no one had really asked me that question, or even grasped the gravity of what it was like living without sound. It's a huge adjustment, it really is. I don't know how to describe it to you, but it can feel awfully lonely at times. It's rather like watching a silent movie every day of your life. I miss the sound of voices, music, birdsong, and even sounds that warn you about impending danger. It's been difficult living in a soundless world. When the taxi driver got to the very next stop, he turned around so I could read his lips. I imagine it must be very challenging, in effect overhauling your entire life and adapting to a new way of living, especially for one who has the ability, or who had the ability, shall I say, to hear before. In a way, someone born deaf doesn't know what they're missing, as they were born that way, so they don't know any different. But you know what you're missing, so that is exceedingly hard. I commend you, young lady, for your incredible courage." "Thanks," I said. "That's very kind of you to say. My trauma counsellor keeps telling me we need to learn to accept change, for it happens to us all in our lives. Moving house, for example, losing a loved one or a pet. She says change is a quintessential part of life that we all need to embrace." "She's not wrong about that, love," said the taxi driver. "I should know. I've been divorced twice. I came from a broken home myself. I had 2 stepmothers. I've moved to 3 states over the last few years. I lost my mother to a brain aneurysm 2 years back. So change is my middle name. It happens to us all. None of us can actually avoid it." The taxi driver travelled down many dirt roads, surrounded by undulating embankments scattered with larches, pines and aspen polar trees, along with pretty flowering meadows, beguiling mountain views. We took a turning down a road that curled through the valley, and the taxi driver stopped to allow a herd of elk to scatter across the road in a group, many glancing at us briefly. In my humble opinion, they seemed remarkably tame for wild deer, as if they weren't unused to humans. "Just to let you know, we're nearly there, love. Do you realize the cabin you have booked is out in the middle of nowhere?" he said, turning around to look at me, while he momentarily stopped the car so that I could read his lips. "You're not going to feel a bit isolated out here. A young girl on her own," he said, looking genuinely concerned, "is a little bit of a concern for me." "That's the whole idea of me coming out here," I assured him. "My trauma counsellor is most insistent of me being out in nature on my own. She says that nothing heals as much as the natural world." The taxi driver reflected about it for a moment. "I think I would hasten to agree with your therapist. If there's any place that is going to heal you, it's here in Banff. When I moved here from Atlanta, I will tell you something. I was on the brink of despair after my second marriage collapsed. The wife was cheating on me. I was devastated, as you can imagine. But when I moved out here, the beauty of this place changed my life." It wasn't long before the taxi drove up this precipitous hilly incline. Up and down it went, as its wheels rolled smoothly down the hilly terrain with effortless ease, until finally the road narrowed towards a gravel path that finally meandered towards the cabin. In my opinion, the cabin, although twee, resembled a Swiss chalet in every regard. It looked whimsically enchanting all on its own, in the heart of this arresting valley, surrounded by viridescent rolling hills, fields of sagebrush, meadows, and a plethora of pretty towering alpine trees that sprawled out into a vast area of wood green, where I could see there were some steep walking trails that looked very inviting. I felt as if I was being welcomed by the trees and the flowers, blanketed by this charming oasis, cushioned cosily by its sumptuous persuasion. The taxi driver helped me with all my baggage and groceries, I'm glad to say. "I think it's very beautiful here," he said. "Are you sure you won't get terribly lonely?" "I'll be absolutely fine," I assured him. "I've brought over a dozen books to read with me. If I need a change of scenery, I'll SMS the taxi service and take a trip into Banff to do a spot of shopping. There's electricity in the cabin, so I'll be able to get a Wi-Fi connection." The taxi driver gave me his card. "Good. Then you can give me an SMS if you need to go to Banff." I thanked the taxi driver, watching him driving away in his taxi, until his vehicle was a tiny speck on the horizon. Then I took the key from under the welcome mat, turned it in the lock, opened the door, and surreptitiously entered the cabin. I gasped at its coziness. It was as snug as a bug, so inviting on the inside, as much as it was on the outside. Suddenly the idea of having this place surrounded by all these enchanting views all to myself seemed very appealing indeed. It was like having a whole chocolate cake to myself, instead of just a measly slice. I felt spoilt and privileged to be here. I was so glad I'd come. The cabin was open-plan living at its finest, with a sweeping staircase that led up to the 2 upstairs bedrooms, and a balcony that overlooked the most magnificent views. The bedrooms possessed the most enormous king-size beds, with mattresses that you could sink into like soft beds of feathery down. It was like no expense had been spared to make this enchanting cabin as luxurious as possible. The white bed linen was made from the finest Egyptian cottons. The duvets and pillows were goose down, and there was a plethora of different shades of white that complemented aquamarines and golds in a colour palette that enhanced the dark wood. The results were phenomenal. Even the pictures on the wall were contemporary artworks done in aquamarines, golds, pinks, lilacs and soft blues, framed in white, so striking against the dark wooden beams. The first week in the cabin had been dreamy. I'd indulged in long hot bubble baths at night, infused with orange blossom essential oil, surrounded by over a dozen lighted candles. I'd soaked luxuriantly in the bath, wallowing away like a hippo in a watering hole in Africa, although I assure you I'm significantly smaller in size, I'm glad to say. I had laid back in my bed, reading sometimes to the early hours of the morning, drinking a glass of high-quality white wine. I'd get out of my bed at lunchtime, go for a leisurely stroll in the woods. I would return home and in the kitchen whip up something delicious to eat. Sometimes at night I had an open fire. When it became cool, I enjoyed the pleasure of watching the orange-red flames crackle and spit in the hearth. It had all been so cosy. I was surprised how out here I forgot about my deafness, and even when I couldn't hear the sound of the birds, I allowed myself to remember those sounds so that I could almost hear them in my imagination, which meant that indirectly I was hearing. One night I awoke with a start. I didn't know why I'd woken up, as I couldn't hear anything at all, but let's just say my instincts were heightened. I got the distinct impression that I wasn't alone. I felt as if something was looking at me. I climbed out of my bed and went from window to window to see if I could see anything, but nothing was there. I glanced out of all the windows, but all I could see was the greyish sky that wasn't so dark, as a full moon cast its shadows across the landscape like a bright lantern. I could discern the silhouettes of the tall vertical trees, the background of the rolling hills. I remember thinking how beautiful everything was. I decided as I was up and about, I would sit on the upper balcony with a glass of wine in my hands and drink it, enjoying a panoramic view of the constellations with the bright twinkling stars and a cheerful moon casting its wispy silvery shadows over the countryside. Then I would return to bed after I'd finished my drink. But that was when I saw this tall, dark, shadowy silhouette disappearing into the woods. It happened so quickly, but I knew by its human shape that it was certainly not a bear. But then what was it? I was so intrigued that I didn't think of my own safety, which after my recent trauma you would think would be foremost in my mind, but it seemed marginally suppressed this evening. Perhaps it was the heady effects of the orange blossom bath that I'd had earlier in the evening, complemented by the relaxing effects of the wine, that I was now feeling exceedingly chilled out and mellow. I wanted to know what this thing was that I'd seen. It even crossed my mind that I might have seen a ghost, and that thought rather excited me for some reason. After having so nearly died in my recent accident, I had a fleeting memory of being in a hospital bed and flung out of my body for a second, only to be pushed back as I heard this voice saying to me, "It's not your time yet." I remember being incredibly annoyed, as I knew that what was out there beyond this reality was so much better than what this world had to offer me. So after my experience in hospital, I was definitely open to the idea of ghosts. I quickly grabbed my headlight, threw on some sneakers and my dressing gown, and dashed out of the cabin as fast as I could, running towards where I'd seen the dark, shadowy figure. I could feel butterflies of excitement whirling around in my stomach. I'm sure the crickets and frogs were chirping, but I could hear only the sound of silence. I could feel a gentle breeze blowing against my face that was very invigorating. And that was when I saw him. He was a tall, dark, towering silhouette, standing against a tree, easily over 7 foot tall, and possibly 600 to 700 pounds. He was burly and big, with powerful shoulders and a body that was built for toughness, speed, endurance, and strength. By contrast, our human bodies seemed pathetically puny. He was covered with long, flowing, dark hair, and possessed a human-like face with high cheekbones and a very defined square jawline. But it was his brown eyes that consumed my undivided attention. They were like liquid pools of unconditional love. I realized with reverent horror that I was actually looking at a Bigfoot. It was the critter's benevolent eyes that delivered me from any fear or trepidation, which would be easy to acquire given the strength and intimidating, daunting power of this mighty beast, which would likely terrify some of the most courageous men. The creature was eyeing me curiously. He looked deep into my eyes and said, "I've been expecting you." I was flabbergasted. Was this creature talking to me in my mind? But these words I were hearing were definitely not my own. I looked at the creature with a flabbergasted expression, not knowing what to say. He looked at me and pointed to my ears and said, "You agreed to this before you were born." I realized he was referring to my deafness. Are you kidding? I thought. I'd never in my right mind agree to anything like this. Never, ever. Who would ever ask to be deaf? The creature said to me, "Be brave, my child. All will be well with you. Remember you are greatly loved. May the good Lord bless you." And then he turned around and glided away. What the hell, I thought. What was that all about? But for some reason the Bigfoot's words soothed my soul. If I had really agreed to my deafness before I was even born, then what did I have to complain about, I thought. I don't know why the Bigfoot was sent to give me this message, or who asked him to give it to me, but it most certainly changed my life. And it was my encounter with this anomalous beast that enabled me to live my life as a deaf woman to the fullest. Who sent the Bigfoot to me, as I was saying, I don't know. And why was he expecting me? I can't answer that question either. But the therapist was absolutely right. It was in the natural world that I found my healing. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was strange to see my first published novel in my hands. I stared at the book incredulously, feeling incredibly proud of my accomplishments. I had never known this day would come, even though I'd seen the moment over thousands of times in my imagination. My greatest longing in life was to become a published author, but be careful for what you wish for, as this had been one hell of a roller coaster ride that involved many hard falls, knocks and setbacks along the way. Of course I had imagined what this moment would feel like, to hold my own published book in my hand, and there was no feeling in the entire world quite like it, especially when I glanced from the title on the cover to my name on the front of the book. Finally all my hard work had paid off. This was not my first book I'd written, but my fifth. Over the last 5 years, 4 of my 5 books had one by one been rejected by the publishers. Looking back, they had not really been that good, and the first one I was actually embarrassed to have even written, and the 2 following that had been total rubbish. Yet all the hard work and dedication, all the sacrifice, had amounted to this monumental, awe-inspiring moment, when as an artist of my craft, I had finally produced something that I was terribly proud of, and now my book was in print. And as I ran my hand over the cover, I wished with all my heart that my grandfather was here with me now, to share in this celebratory moment, as he would be literally throwing his arms up in the air and saying, "I told you, Missy, you could do it! I knew you could!" Before long I'd see my books standing pride of place in bookshops all over the country, or available online for purchase. I'd never felt more self-accomplished and fulfilled in my entire life than I did right now. Even when I was a little girl, I had been drawn to books from an early age. I'd find myself staring wistfully at the covers of books in bookshops and libraries, with wide, mesmerized eyes. I would study the book I'd selected studiously, reading the description on the cover, and if it appealed to me, I would take that book out of the library, or I'd save up all my pocket money to buy it. With every fictional book I read, I would be sucked in, down a vortex into an imaginary world that seemed so much more exciting and exhilarating than the real world we lived in. My parents would have to practically drag me, kicking and screaming, away from the library. Ostensibly, when I walked through those sliding doors that beckoned me into that large, never-ending collection of books, I'd never ever want to walk out of that place again. I was like a kid in a candy store, spoiled for choice, unable to decide which books to take out, which to leave behind. There were, of course, occasions that I would read 3 books all at once, and I wasn't sure which book I would like best. That's why I did it. I even asked my mother once why the stories in books were so much better than the happenings and goings-on in real life, because sometimes my fictional stories swept me away in what I considered to be a much more believable world than my very own life. "That's not necessarily true," my mother had said to me.
Every one of our lives is a story that we're acting out every day. That's why some people write their own autobiographies, don't they? Celebrities do it all the time. On the surface, our stories may appear less exciting than those books we get out from the library or buy at the bookshop, because we're living them, even as we speak. Our lives are more drawn out and in-depth, but a story in a fictional book is much more condensed, and so the drama it embodies has a greater impact on you, which is why stories you get off the shelf are so much more gripping, but it doesn't actually mean that they are.
You're wrong, Mummy, I told her. Books are much more exciting than the real world. And I really believed that, with a steadfast, ironclad conviction, which was why I read and read as a child with an unquenchable appetite that simply could not be satisfied. By contrast, other children my age fancied going on an adventure ride at a fairground, to Disneyland, the circus perhaps, even a great movie, while I would naturally enjoy those things to a moderate degree, but my greatest pleasure, overriding them all, always involved reading a book. I loved the way the story would take me, away from the humdrum practicalities of everyday life, which might involve laborious household chores, or pitifully boring homework. When I got stuck into a story, I would malleably become the character, having the wonderful, thrilling, sometimes scary ride of a lifetime, surfing on the tumultuous, choppy waves of the author's words, without even getting my feet wet. I mean, what could be better than that? It came as no surprise to my parents that I wanted to become an author one day, from a very early age, as I couldn't have envisaged anything more wonderful than having my own collection of stories in print, and having my name proudly staring back at me from the glossy cover. I would get a strange reaction from adults when I told them what I wanted to become. I want to be an author one day.
An author? They would say, raising a brow. Well, that's a first. Most kids wanted to be a fireman, police officers, a school teacher, a doctor, and so my startling proclamations were taken a lot more serious than others, because wanting to be an author is not what every child would normally envisage for themselves. My parents were naturally quick to observe that books pretty much consumed my life, and they were not avid readers themselves, so they couldn't comprehend or remotely relate to my passion. My mother thought I loved books because I was an only child, and that I turned to books to offer me the entertainment a friendship would have provided me, as I didn't have siblings to play with, and my mother felt guilty about this fact. But I never ever got the impression that they wanted to have other children. I had come along as a fortuitous surprise that they gladly welcomed, but certainly no other children were on the horizon of their lives. My parents certainly tried to actively discourage this wild, fanciful idea of mine to become an author, which was not desperately hip at the time. People very much liked their children to follow much more secure careers, where they were guaranteed a fixed, faithful income that would set you up for life. Of course, things have changed a lot these days.
"Love," my father would say to me, "being a writer is not what it's cracked up to be. It can be a lonely life. Lots of sacrifice, lots and lots of hard work. You sometimes have to put so much into what you do for so very little return. Some authors don't get paid terribly well. If you're a very good writer, you can make your craft look easy to your readers, when in reality it is anything but. Very often your work is overlooked, underappreciated and underpaid, unless, of course, you're a best-selling author. And if that is the case, the world could be a very bright place indeed, and the future rather promising. And then again, you're only as good as your last bestseller. The big problem is there are no guarantees in any profession, most especially becoming an author, even a best-selling one. It's a long, hard, tumultuous road, believe me, and not many actually make it. Me and your mother, we'd hate to see that happen to you, love."
"Your father's right," my mother would say. "You should listen to him. Even if you were to become an author one day, what if your hard work never got published?
Imagine how soul-destroying and disenfranchising that would be for you. You could produce excellent work, and in fact I'm sure you would. But if a publisher didn't like it, it would never be published unless you did it yourself. So much of your self-sacrifice would have amounted to absolutely nothing. And that happens to a lot of aspiring authors, you know. I couldn't think of anything more demoralizing than having your work rejected over and over again as if it's not good enough. It's like constantly receiving a slap in the face. If you want to write for a living, become a journalist for goodness sake, or work for an up-and-coming magazine where your articles will get published.
My grandfather was the very opposite. He told me all the reasons I should. We all need someone like that in our lives, who really believes in us no matter how far-fetched and idealistic or even out of reach our dreams may seem at the time. My grandfather recognized my burning passion for storytelling was actually a gift of God. Beyond that, he himself had been blessed with the gift of the gab, and loved nothing better than to sit around a crackling fire in their beautiful wooden home, with their high ceilings, large hearty open fireplaces, and generous-sized rooms, with breathtakingly beguiling views over the mountains. My grandfather would tell me a really good story, or failing that, he'd read to me from a book he selected from his large library, as like me, he was an impassioned reader, and gobbled up books as hungrily as I did. I think if my grandfather had given it more thought, he might have personally enjoyed becoming a writer himself. So you could say we were like two peas in a pod, in a manner of speaking. But we were both from two completely different generations. But we both got each other. And so in my young life, my grandfather was my biggest cheerleader. I think my father was incredibly irritated with my grandfather for inspiring me to follow my heart.
"Why are you telling Missy to become an author?" he would complain. "I don't want her to go down such a miserable, forsaken path. She'll end up living the sequestered life of a hermit, writing books that may never ever be published. Do you realize how soul-destroying that will be for her? As far as I'm concerned, that is no way for a young lady to live. This is not the kind of life I envisage for Missy. I'd thank you kindly to think long and hard before you start filling my daughter's head with all these wistful, unrealistic fancies." "Who says it's a miserable path, Kevin?" my grandfather would interject. "Being a writer does not necessarily mean Missy will live like a hermit. Where on earth did you get that strange, idiosyncratic idea from? Even if she never gets published, does it actually matter? She's still doing something she loves. Surely that's what every father wants for their children. Above anything else, for them to be following their passions. I know people who paint landscapes because they love painting. It brings them joy. Their work is never sold in galleries. But you know what? They're doing what they love. If we want to live a fulfilled life, we need to follow our hearts, pursue our passions, because that's what we're supposed to be doing. I've learnt this in my advancing age, you know. Furthermore, it is not something we can personally choose. It's ingrained within our psyche as human beings, is it not? To do what brings us the greatest pleasure and fulfillment. It's what we're here on this earth for. We're all uniquely individualistic. What fuels one person's interest might drive another away. "Well, I love woodwork, don't I?" said my father. "But I work as an engineer, full-time. And why do I do that? Because it brings money to the table. I cannot afford to spend long, lonely hours getting stuck into my favourite hobby. I would like to remind you, Dad, that some of us, we have to work for a living. Do you think the man at the burger bar enjoys flipping burgers? Or the cleaner enjoys picking up your dirty laundry after you? I don't think so. But they do it. Why do they do it? For the money. Because at the end of the day we need to make a living. And that often involves doing things we might hate. It involves sacrifice. That's what I don't understand about you, Kevin. You're always following the money trail, aren't you? That is not always the answer for every person. Do what you love, for God's sake, and the money will follow. Trust me on this one. If you want to become a carpenter full-time, there is no reason why it cannot be profitable for you to do so. You could start your own furniture shop. Do what you love, for God's sake, Kevin. We only live once. You don't get it, do you, Dad? Life isn't as simple, as straightforward as it was in your day. Besides, I don't mind my job as an engineer. It pays a lot better than being a carpenter, let me tell you. Me and the wife, we want to travel the world. Making money is a way of accomplishing our goals to do just that. There are so many places we are eager to visit. Well, there you go, son. Travelling is important to you. So you're making the money you need to achieve your goal. That's an accomplishment. It's following your dream, in a manner of speaking. Dad, I get where you're going with this. But you fail to appreciate what I'm really trying to tell you. That being an author is not the right choice for Missy. I want something a whole lot better for her. I want her to get married one day, have children. And if she wants to become an English teacher, or to write articles for magazines, by all means she can do that, with the greatest of pleasure. Indeed, I would be the first to encourage her, and say, you go, girl. But I'm sorry. Writing books, that's too much for her to take on. And what if she becomes a mother one day? Writing books is all-consuming. It takes over your life. It robs you of quality time you can spend with your own family. Kevin, my grandfather would say, have you not heard a word I've been trying to say to you? If Missy wants to be a writer one day, you are never going to be able to stop her doing what she wants. That's the whole point of what I've been trying to tell you all along. What you seem to fail to appreciate is you cannot live under your daughter's shadow, nor can you live your life vicariously through her, even if you would like to do so. Many well-meaning parents feel just like you do. They want to dictate the course of their children's lives. They disingenuously believe they know better, but you cannot make someone do what they don't want to do. What you want for Missy's life may not be what she wants for her life. You cannot impose your will on your child. She will resent you for that. It's no different from planting a plant in conditions that are unfavourable for it. It'll kill the plant. We all need the right environment to thrive, and Missy's world is all about books. I don't think what you say necessarily is true, said my father. Parents are supposed to guide their children to make better choices for themselves. Sometimes parents do know better. I'm sorry, but they do. And I know better for Missy. We have experience on our side, wisdom too. We know how the world works, and the world can be a very unfair place. What kind of a life can a writer expect to have? Except a solitary, very lonely one. Here we go again, Kevin. Around and around the mulberry bush. Where do you get these preposterous ideas about authors from? You think they're all hermits, don't you? I'd like to remind you that many authors are happily married with children, and they still pursue their passion. Why don't you want the same for Missy? I don't understand you at times, Kevin. I really don't. I remember my father tirelessly arguing with my grandfather at great length about this contentious issue. In the end, I think they agreed to disagree. But my father was hell-bent throughout my childhood in knocking this whimsical, fanciful idea of mine, of becoming an author, right out of my head. But his efforts, as my grandfather had warned him, were completely futile. It was rather like trying to ask a dog to become vegetarian. Try putting lettuce in a dog's bowl, forcing him to eat it. It's never going to happen, as a dog is not hardwired to eat lettuce, although for digestive issues, dogs have been known to chew on grass, and I will concede to that. My grandfather was the one that would take me under the canopy of the night sky when I stayed at their charming home in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He would point up at the Milky Way
and the endless collection of bright glittering stars that gilded the night sky with their pomp and ceremony.
Those stars, he would tell me, are like people's dreams. There are so many of them. You can pick one out, Missy, whichever one you want, tailor-made especially for you, so that it fits you perfectly, like an evening gown that has been made especially for you to measure. You can have anything you want in your life, Missy, he would tell me. But there is only one catch. You must believe in your dreams. Do you believe, Missy?
I believe, I told my Gramps. I believe, Gramps, that I'm going to write books one day. I'm going to be a published author, and I don't care what my dad and mum say about it, 'cause they don't understand. But I'm going to take people on journeys with my stories, Gramps, so they don't have to leave their houses. They can go out on a big adventure with me. They can ride on the back of my words, like an adventure ride on a playground. I mean, you can't get better escapism than that, can you, Gramps?
You took the very words right out of my head, little Missy. Very well put indeed. There is no greater escapism than a story. Life is hard enough as it is. Sometimes we really need to leave the heedlessly mundane behind us. And words, they can do that for us, can't they? Words have great power to take us on a wild adventure that we can experience through all our senses. I think it's perfectly wonderful that you want to write for a living, Missy, he would tell me. Nothing in this world is more satisfying, more uplifting than a jolly good story. This generation, you know, often falsely believe that previous generations like mine, that did not have television, must have been bored out of their skulls. But they're very wrong about that, you know. We were never ever bored. We had stories to entertain us, and those stories far exceeded some of the trash we watch on television today. Let me tell you that, Missy.
Your Gramps is right, my grandmother would say with a bright twinkle in her eyes. Nothing in this world beats a good story. When I was growing up, Missy, me and my sisters would live on stories. We didn't have television in those days, as your grandfather was saying. So stories were our greatest form of entertainment. And every night, until late in our teens, our fathers would tell us stories every single night without fail, before we retired to bed. When television first came out, I really thought it would be so much better than all the storytelling, that it would be a game changer for us. But it wasn't all it was cracked up to be, you know. In the beginning it was a novelty. Of course it was, owning a television. We believed it would transform our lives quite miraculously. But when I stopped to really think about it, it never ever came close to matching the pleasure we received from my father's storytelling. Never close, not even for a moment. Do you know, Missy, sometimes the old ways are actually the very best, the most reliable. I still haven't forgotten the many stories my father would tell us when I was a little girl. Much like your grandfather. My father knew how to tell a really good story that would get your pulse racing and your breath tightly squeezed in your lungs. On both sides of the family, we come from a long line of storytellers. So it does boggle my mind, Missy, that both your parents do not understand your eagerness to become a writer, to tell your own stories for people to enjoy one day. My grandparents lived in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a spectacularly beautiful part of the world, in a stunning wooden home that in many ways resembled a rather grandiose-looking Swiss chalet, which possessed prepossessing views over the mountains. What could be more breathtaking than that? My grandfather had built this house from scratch, out of a design he'd drawn up when he was a young 12-year-old boy. He drew the design on a scrap of paper that he kept for many years and stashed under the floorboards. He'd look at that drawing every single day until the paper disintegrated in his hands, as he'd looked at it so much. From that young, tender age, my grandfather envisaged owning his own home. He had grown up in impoverished circumstances. He wanted to break free from the poverty mindset by believing in something bigger and better for himself and his future. By the time my grandfather was 21, he had already become a landowner and had set to work in building a home that even by modern-day standards was way ahead of its time. With my grandfather's own blood and sweat and tears, he skillfully built his entire house from scratch, with some help, of course, from his brothers and his father, long before he even met my grandmother, and even before my father was born. My grandfather later ended up making a living, a very substantial one at that, with his ingeniously masterful designs. He began to build mountain homes for people. He was incredibly skilled at using his hands, and began to run a professional business concern with his brothers for several years. And this he did without any college or university degrees behind him. He was completely self-taught. My grandfather lifted his family out of poverty, transforming their lives, because he was such a visionary. It was at 12 years of age, after he'd drawn up his masterful plan for a home on a piece of paper, that he began to work for a local farmer in the area. He had told Farmer Elvin that he would work for him for 10 long years without any payment, on one condition only, that Farmer Elvin in return would give him a large piece of his redundant, heavily wooded land at the back of his property that he never ever used. The farmer thought it was a good deal, after some reflective persuasion, and after he realized my grandfather had become an indispensable, invaluable asset to his ranch. When my grandfather was 21, true to his word, the farmer gave my grandfather the land he had bequeathed him. My grandfather used to live by the age-old adage, "Where there's a will, there is almost certainly a way. And if you really want something enough, Missy, if you believe in it, it will be yours." During the school holidays, both my parents would send me to stay with my grandparents. My mother worked full-time as a receptionist for a dental surgery in New York. I think she enjoyed the job to an extent, but her main reason for working was to raise as much money as possible in order to pursue her dreams. Money was the gateway to accomplishing those. My parents were passionate about travel. They were desirous to circumnavigate the globe, and you needed money, and a lot of it, to be able to do that. They were ambitious travellers, jet-setters you could say, for their generation, and were the most well-travelled people I knew. When my parents both took time off work for their holidays, they preferred to shoot off to all kinds of exotic, very fascinating locations abroad. They visited so many spectacular places all around the globe, not all of them glamorous, to remote, faraway destinations. My mother would point to an obscure, faraway place on the globe that you have likely never ever heard of before, and say, "Let's go there, shall we?" And that's what they would invariably do. It became like a game to them, with gainful rewards and indelible memories. I was naturally excluded from these intrepid adventures, and was probably only a passing afterthought. It was not that my parents didn't want me around. Of course they did. But I'm most sure that on some of these overseas excursions, a young child would likely have got in their way and under their feet. So taking me along would have almost certainly complicated things, and I fully understood that. It was certainly easier for them to send me away to stay with my grandparents, who were only too thrilled to take me under their wings. I was incredibly close to my grandfather, who was the only person in my entire life that really understood the way I thought. My grandfather on a cold winter's night, by an open fire crackling away merrily in the huge fireplace in the cosy living room, would read to me, tell me a story. I'd sit there with wide, earnest eyes, hanging on to his every single word. For a long time, I believed that only good stories in life were conjured up by the imaginations of great authors, or people like my grandfather, who knew how to spin a really good yarn. I was later to learn that some of the greatest, most incredible stories can indeed be real, and that the world as we know it is a whole lot more mysterious and enigmatic than we could have ever envisaged. I would never have believed this, of course, until some rather bizarre, cryptic things happened to me when I was staying with my grandparents. Stuff that I'm about to tell you about now. I sometimes wonder if it was the universe's way, a humorous way of saying, "You've got me wrong. I'm a hell of a lot more fascinating and mysterious than you give me credit for." All these years later, some of my own personal experiences have almost certainly inspired some of my fictional writing. For indeed, out of the works of great fiction lie buried many empowering truths, and much of what is written about in fiction was probably birthed from a real-life story in the first place, which leads me to conclude that maybe fiction is not sourced from our imaginations after all, but it almost certainly happened at some place and in some time to somebody on this earth. On many mornings my grandfather would go fishing at the creek in the woods. Sometimes we would eat the fish he had skillfully caught for dinner. My grandmother would bake the fish in the oven. It would be lovingly wrapped in foil, served with lemongrass and vegetables. It would melt in the mouth like butter. It was so different from the fish my mother bought at the market in New York that in my opinion always tasted rather fishy, which was something I could never understand at the time. The fish my grandmother cooked was flaky and buttery. It was so fresh, and that was why it was like that. That was the quintessential difference. A fish that tastes fishy is probably not that fresh after all. Sometimes I would go fishing with my grandfather on these early morning jaunts, and other times I'd stay behind at the house to help my grandmother in the kitchen, as I thoroughly enjoyed baking, and I had an unquenchable sweet tooth. On this particular morning I was helping my grandmother bake her world-famous lemon chiffon cake, and to date I have never ever eaten a cake that tasted halfway as good. You only had to mention the word lemon chiffon cake, and my grandfather would abandon everything he was doing in a hurry just to have a slice of his favourite cake. Because even in his own words, he would say that my grandmother's lemon chiffon cake was pretty much as close to heaven as you could possibly get, without having to die first. In my grandfather's mind, if the pearly gates were made out of my grandmother's lemon chiffon cake, then heaven would be a very welcome place indeed. On this morning I'd helped my grandmother carefully mix the ingredients together in the bowl. I had sat on the doorstep, licking out the bowl, savouring the delicious sweet lemony taste of the batter. I had watched the cake rising through the glass door of the oven, and waited somewhat impatiently for about 25 minutes or so, until my grandmother had opened the oven door to inspect the cake. She'd insert a wooden stick into the cake, and when it came out clean, it was as good as ready. I would watch her remove the cake from the oven with her oven gloves. The kitchen would be flooded with the mouth-watering, irresistible caramel-like smells of lemon mingled with butter and sugar. My grandmother popped 2 halves of the cake onto a wire rack, and would look at me with a twinkle in her eyes. "Missy, go and get your grandfather, will you? Tell him I've got his favourite cake for tea."
"Are we going to have some lemon chiffon cake now?"
I would ask her, unable to disguise the enthusiastic excitement in my voice, as the thought of eating my grandmother's lemon chiffon cake was making me drool like a dog over his bone. "But of course, dear. Nothing tastes better than a cake freshly baked and warm out of the oven." My grandmother must have chuckled as I bolted out of the kitchen and ran across the flowery meadow, buffeted in the furthest distance by the smouldering silhouettes of the Rubenesque Blue Ridge Mountains that confiscated the skyline with their sculptural repose. On this morning the mountains were shrouded by a burgeoning white mist that gave them a mysterious, almost ethereal quality. I hurriedly ran towards the trees. I'm sure my grandmother was probably watching me from the kitchen window, and continuing to chuckle at my expense, as it wouldn't have been hard for her to see the level of ebullience I exerted as I shot through the trees like a bullet that had been discharged with a very straight trajectory. I couldn't wait to get my teeth into that warm lemon chiffon cake that was awaiting me back in the kitchen, soon to be served with rich dollops of double-thick vanilla cream and freshly sliced strawberries. It was not long before I was in the heart of the wood grove, exhaustively running down the familiar path, bespeckled with leaf litter from the previous fall, that was fast turning into a rich, black, densely fertile marsh. There was a cool breeze blowing against my cheeks, as my eager shoes beat the ground, while my breathing became ragged as my pace increased. The morning sun peeked mischievously through the leafy green canopy above my head, dappling the floor in dancing prisms of beguiling light. Everything was terribly pretty. The green shoots of recovery had hijacked the brown bleached remnants of the past very cold, austere winter. Pretty little flowers bobbed their bright little heads through the ground, freckling the grassland. The wood grove was full of bright colours, rich green foliage, and rambling wild berries that grew among the scattered thorny briars. That's funny, I thought, stopping in my tracks. I had heard the familiar sound of my grandfather's heavy boots thumping the ground. He was moving in the opposite direction to the creek, which was decidedly odd. But then again, I decided that my grandfather must have abandoned his fishing. He might have got discouraged if the fish weren't biting, and taken a casual stroll in the woods instead. I knew he thoroughly enjoyed walking in the woods. It was lucky I'd heard him. I'd be able to catch up with him now, instead of make a wasted trip to the creek, where I'd likely find he'd only just abandoned his fishing tackle. I began to run after my grandfather. I was too out of breath to call his name, but I called out to him when I saw a brief flash of his very distinctive red plaid shirt in the distance. "Gramps!" I called. "Gramps!" But he failed to answer my calls, and as far as I knew, he was never hard of hearing. Why did he seem to be wilfully ignoring me? Or was it that the wind had drowned out my voice? I decided the latter must be the case, for my grandfather would never ever ignore me. My grandfather always wore a red or brown plaid shirt when he went fishing, especially if the weather was slightly on the cool side. So I was in absolutely no doubt that the man in the red plaid shirt had to be him. I mean, who else could it be, walking through the trees on his property? "Gramps! Gramps! Gramps!" I called again and again, raising the cadence of my voice to above the wind. "Gramps, it's me, Missy! I'm over here!" I ran right up to him, but as I was about to tap him very gently on the shoulders, the man in the red plaid shirt that I believed was my grandfather simply vanished before my eyes, as if he'd never been there in the first place, rather like a mirage of water that you might see in the far distance, but when you get to the spot where you believed the water was, nothing is there. I was so genuinely startled by this bizarre set of enigmatic, paradoxical circumstances that I almost certainly could not explain. I trembled from the aftershock of the experience, taking in big gulps of fresh air. What on earth was going on? I was completely floored. I knew that I'd seen my grandfather. So how could he have just vanished like that before my very eyes, like the steam from a kettle? In truth, I thought either I was going stark raving mad, or it must have been a deceptively good trick of the light, or I was seeing things that weren't actually there. Seconds later, I heard someone having a good old chuckle at my expense. "Ha ha 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 ha!" Whoever they were definitely laughing at me. And when I say laughing, I mean a really big, satisfying, full-bodied laugh. Someone who found the confusion of my grandfather's apparent vanishing act hilariously funny. The giggling persisted. At this point I thought my grandfather had to be the giggler. He was the guilty party here, playing a trick on me, like a magician pulling out a white rabbit from his hat. How had my grandfather masterfully managed to dematerialize before my very eyes? It had to be some kind of optical illusion, I thought. The strange laughter persisted, and I did not appreciate being laughed at like this. My grandfather was very good at pulling my leg, so I was absolutely certain this had to be one of his jokes, like the coin trick he would regularly pull on me, where a coin seemed to appear mysteriously from behind his ear, and I could never figure out how he did it. "Gramps, this isn't funny!" I called out to him. "Wherever you are, come out of your hiding place now. You're freaking me out. All right, I admit you got me. It was a good trick." I looked around, feeling somewhat bemused, and that was when I saw him. At the time, I was not certain what I was seeing. I was not exactly well versed on the subject of cryptid creatures, or Bigfoot for that matter, but I observed a tall, lofty man, covered in hair, but in the light of the morning sun, twinkling generously through the canopy, I noticed the hair colour was definitely a deep brown and as close to black as you can get. The Bigfoot looked startlingly human on his face, because he looked like a man, just covered in hair. That's the best way to actually describe him. Only he was absolutely humongous. The hairy man chuckled and pointed to where I thought my grandfather had been only moments before. He continued to laugh, throwing back his head, clutching his stomach, as if the laughing had made his stomach hurt. I have never, ever heard laughter like that before or since. It was so infectious that it did not only make me smile, but laugh as well. The hairy man shook his head as his magnificent bright eyes looked into mine, and for a brief moment I was caught up in his mesmerizing stare. I observed that his bright, cheerful, friendly eyes were a dark honey-brown colour. They twinkled with merriment and humour. The hairy man nodded at me. He chuckled again, turning around and disappearing into the trees. I watched him gliding away, swinging his arms backwards and forwards. He never looked over his shoulders back at me once, but his chuckling continued, long after he'd vanished from my sight. At this point I was wondering if I was wildly hallucinating, or if I'd somehow entered an alternative reality, where some men were clearly covered in hair, and others simply vanished before your eyes and reminded you of your grandfather. I wondered if I'd seen what I thought I'd seen, because when you see something that should not exist in your reality, the first thing you do is engage in doubt. "I didn't see that," I told myself, as I was digesting the oddity of what had happened, and trying to wrap my head around the outlandish set of circumstances. Moments later my attention was stolen by the fortuitous presence of my grandfather, in his red plaid shirt, walking nonchalantly down the earthen trail through the trees towards me, his fishing gear rattling rather precariously as he moved. He stopped short in his tracks when he saw me. There was an expression of confoundment on his heavily creased face, for I was not whom he was expecting to see at this particular moment.
"Fancy seeing you here, Missy. I wasn't expecting that. What a nice surprise this is. I'm going to call it for the morning, I have to say. Nothing was biting back at the creek. Can you believe that? It's one of those days, I think. Your grandmother was saying she wouldn't mind it if we had baked fish for lunch today, but I'm afraid that's not going to happen. I hate to let your grandmother down, but I didn't even get a biter, not even a few tiny scragglers. I guess some days it just ain't happening. What are you doing here?" he said again, his face crumpling up into one of his irresistibly warm, friendly smiles that always made my heart melt like butter. "Don't tell me. I know what it is. You were missing your grandfather so much. You had to pay him a visit," he said, giving me a wink. "Did you get tired of baking with your grandmother? I find that very hard to believe."
"No, of course I didn't get tired of baking. But I don't understand, Gramps. I don't understand."
"You don't understand what, Missy?"
I pointed in bemusement back at the trees along the path. "I don't understand, Gramps, how you did that. How did you pull it off? You really had me fooled. You have to tell me how you did it, 'cause it's niggling me. It really is."
"How did I do what, love? You're confusing me," my grandfather asked.
He raised an inquiring, bushy white brow above his pale blue eyes. "You were over there," I said, pointing at the path ahead of me. "I saw you very, very clearly in your red plaid shirt that you're wearing now. I was calling you. You ignored me. Then when I got
love, I have no idea what you're talking about, said my Gramps. I was never ahead of you on the path. I've only got here right now, as you can see. Besides, I'm sure you would have heard me a mile away with the rattling sound my fishing tackle always makes. I told you the fish weren't biting today at the creek. I decided to call it in for the morning. My patience was wearing very thin. That's normally your problem, but it was mine today. Maybe tomorrow I will be luckier. No, I was definitely not ahead of you on the trail, nor was I playing any tricks on you. Mind you, that sounds like a pretty good one. I might be sleight of hand, but I could never pull off a stunt like that, especially not carrying all this fishing tackle with me on my person, he said, pointing to his fishing rod and tackle that he was carrying.
But it was you, Gramps. I saw you very, very clearly in your red plaid shirt. You were over there. It was definitely you, and then you were gone.
You must have been mistaken, love. You haven't answered my question, Missy. Why aren't you with your grandmother in the kitchen baking? What are you doing out here on the footpath?
She asked me to call you. She's made lemon chiffon cake for tea. She wanted me to tell you.
Goodness gracious, love. Why on earth didn't you say? Said my Gramps, increasing his pace in earnest. You know how I feel about your grandmother's lemon chiffon cake. We need to get to the kitchen while it's still warm, don't we? I love that cake best when it's just come out of the oven, served with dollops of thick cream and strawberries. I decided not to tell my grandfather what had happened to me along the path. As to be frank, I didn't actually know what had happened myself. I guess I was wondering if I had seen my grandfather on the path along with that strange human-looking creature after all. I brushed what had happened to me away, as if it was water off a duck's back, until of course it happened again. This time I could not have mistaken the man in the red plaid jacket for my grandfather, because I'd been with my grandfather fishing by his sides only moments before. So on this occasion I knew exactly where he was at that point in time. I knew he'd never left the fishing pier. Nothing had been biting that morning for me, so I felt frustrated, as my grandfather had successfully caught 5 fish, and nothing had touched my line. And if you've ever been fishing before, and been next to someone who's pulling in fish like it's nobody's business, and nothing is touching your line, let's not kid. You feel not only frustrated, but increasingly disheartened. And I was in that kind of disenchanted mindset.
I've had enough of fishing. I don't want to do any more fishing right now,
I told my grandfather, unable to hide the glum-looking sulk that had developed on my face.
I don't want to do this any more. I'm going to go back to the house. I think I will read a book or something, or help Granny in the kitchen. This is getting so boring.
Why are you being like this, Missy? Said my grandfather, frowning.
Because, Gramps, you've caught 5 big fish already, and I've caught nothing. How do you expect me to feel? I think I'm a useless fisherman. For some reason, the fish don't ever like me.
Don't be like that, Missy. That's a defeatist attitude if ever I heard one. I've been lucky, that's all. I'm sure with a little bit more patience and practice you'll catch something yourself. You just need to persevere a little.
Gramps, it's not going to happen. Why don't you listen to me? I told you the fish don't like me. It's as simple as that.
What is my favourite saying, Missy? Said my grandfather, looking at me through his piercing blue eyes with a fixed look.
If at first you don't succeed, try again,
I said, making a disgruntled face.
That isn't even true, Gramps. I don't believe it.
Oh, you do. Now cast out another line, love. Place a wiggly worm at the end, and exercise a wee bit of patience. That's all it needs. I've been lucky this morning, as I keep telling you. But there are days that I don't catch a damn thing. And yes, I admit it's disappointing, but it is what it is. Life is always a roller coaster ride, Missy. We have our good days, we have our bad days, but you enjoy them all. It's part of the experience of living. If we only had good days, how would we appreciate them without the benefits of experiencing the very opposite? Who knows, maybe your luck is about to change. Just exercise a little patience, and you may be surprised what the morning will dish out for you. I put down my rod. I don't feel lucky today, Gramps. I'm going to stretch my legs. I'll be back in a moment. I've got a cramp from sitting in the same position too long. I feel a bit stiff.
At your age, you feel like that? Wait until you get to mine. I hope you're not making convenient excuses, Missy, just so you can abandon the fishing. Now don't be too long, said my grandfather, looking up at me and giving me a friendly wink. It was a relief for me to walk away from the creek, to make my way up the hilly incline in order to stretch my legs, and that was when I saw a flash of red and glimpsed the man wearing a red plaid shirt or jacket, if you like, walking through the grove. Now I was curious, because who was he? He shouldn't be here. I'd never seen him before a day in my life. And observing him as he walked through the trees, I wondered why I'd ever so foolishly mistaken him for my grandfather. Perhaps I'd previously been focusing too much on the red plaid shirt. The man was definitely a lot younger than my grandfather, and his hair was blonde from the back, not white. The man moved very fast. His gait was much more youthful and nimble. His stride was generous and purposeful, much more so than my grandfather's, who walked with a light limp in his left foot after a recent ankle sprain that was still giving him trouble. My curiosity was now piqued. I needed to find out who this mysterious young man was. I'd never been a shrinking violet before, and I was not about to start now. I eagerly ran after the curious stranger, wondering what on earth he was doing on my grandfather's land. He shouldn't be here. There were moments on the trail he would stop, scanning the ground with his eyes, almost as if he was searching for something. "Excuse me," I called out after him. "Excuse me." Never quite managing to reach him, he seemed to walk a lot faster than I did. The mysterious man in the red plaid shirt did not acknowledge me whatsoever. He never so much as turned around, which I thought was rather weird. I was not put off, as I persistently ran after the man, and when I reached him, I was completely out of breath, and was only standing a foot away from him. "Excuse me," I called after him. That was when the man turned around to look directly at me. I knew he could see me clearly. The man's eyes met mine for a brief second. They were a piercing blue colour, just like my grandfather's, but he was a much younger man. He was in his 20s, quite handsome, with a sun-kissed bronze-coloured skin and a few freckles on his nose. That was how clearly I saw him. For some reason the man never said anything to me. He simply turned around and walked away, and then promptly disappeared before my very eyes, like he'd done before. And in that moment I realized that the man in the red plaid shirt had to be a ghost. This had never occurred to me before, for I had never thought that ghosts existed, nor would I have expected to see one in the middle of the day like this. But now I was in no doubt that this is what I'd seen, and it threw me for six. I stared incredulously at the path ahead of me, looking completely gobsmacked. I was rather like a bird that had been thrown off my perch, and was trying to reorientate myself and get my bearings right. I could sense I was being watched, even scrutinized, you could say, and the chuckling I had experienced on my previous encounter with the man in the red plaid shirt erupted all over again, like it had done the time before. "It's not funny," I called out. "You think it's funny, do you? I don't like being laughed at, and I know you're there, so don't hide from me again." I glanced towards the trees, and a curtain of foliage appeared to be shaking, like a quaking aspen tree. I could see some dark hair, and then a familiar hairy face, peeking at me mischievously through the foliage, staring at me with twinkling, amused dark eyes.
Once again he was throwing his pyramid-shaped head back into laughter, clutching his stomach so tightly. He was engaged in a deep belly laugh, the kind of laughter they say prolongs our lives and is very good for our health. But few of us laugh like that these days, and when we do it feels really good, as if our stomach has been fully massaged. I now realized why he was laughing. I had been chasing after a ghost. I could not help but feel a tad annoyed to be the butt of someone's jokes, even though when the hairy man laughed, he did rather make me smile.
It's not funny, I repeated again. You think it's funny, do you? I don't appreciate being laughed at.
The hairy man looked at me, and I heard in my head,
"Oh, but it is funny. You didn't know, did you? You should have seen your face. You were so shocked when he vanished."
I was about to say something else, but the hairy man already turned around and had walked through the trees, and on the wind I could hear him chuckling again. The hairy man was a very poor conversationalist. He didn't stick around for long. He was friendly but aloof. I was disappointed that he was gone. In a strange way I found his presence oddly reassuring, and I kind of liked him. He did have a great sense of humour. I'd have to give him that, even if it did involve laughing at me. When I realized I'd seen a ghost and digested this revelation, I hurriedly ran back to my grandparents' house and never rejoined my grandfather at the creek to continue fishing, because that was not going to happen. I was feeling so confounded by my bizarre, paradoxical experience. I was eager to tell my grandmother what I'd seen, because it felt kind of thrilling telling all who will listen that you've seen a ghost. My mind was a whirl of questions. I was not scared of having encountered a ghost, because the experience had not been remotely scary, but it had been idiosyncratic, so much so that I couldn't make sense of it. What was that man in the plaid shirt or jacket doing on our property? Why was his ghost haunting my grandparents' woodgrove in the middle of the day, of all things? And more to the point, what on earth was he actually looking for? It seemed like my real life here at my grandfather's house had become more fanciful than some of the fictitious books I was reading at the time, and oddly enough, the experience rather delighted me. I'd always been drawn to thrilling mysteries, and I knew that the man in the red plaid shirt had a story to tell, as does any ghost, I suspect.
"You're back early,"
said my grandmother, looking at me through her inquiring eyes, when I charged rather abruptly through the door with a rambunctious eagerness. My grandmother had been kneading dough. She wiped the flour from her hands onto her apron that was tied around her rather ample middle.
"What is it, love? Are you all right? Did you not enjoy the fishing with your grandfather?" "Grammy, do you believe in ghosts?"
I asked her. My grandmother repeated the question.
"Do I believe in ghosts? Now that's a good question. Where is this coming from, Missy? You do ask strange things at times, you know."
"But do you, Granny? I need to know."
"Do I believe in ghosts? Well, as a matter of fact, I do, Missy. Not that I've ever seen a ghost before, of course. But you know, when I was a little girl, my father would tell us a plethora of ghost stories growing up. Some of them, he swore, were absolutely true, and I never doubted them for a moment. Why do you ask, Missy?"
"Because, Granny, I've just seen a ghost," I said, looking at her through wide, excited eyes. "Granny, did you hear what I said? I've just seen a real, live ghost in the middle of the day. Not even at night, in the day."
"You've what?"
she asked me, wiping her forehead with her hand.
"What did you say, love? I think I misheard you. Say that again, will you?"
"I told you, Granny, I've seen a ghost, Ghost, along with a hairy man. I think he lives in the woods, but he's nice. But he's a bit evasive and he's always laughing.
I think Gramps wouldn't mind him living there 'cause he's wild like the animals are, if you know what I mean. But he's very shy, I think. But he won't get cold during the winter months because he's covered in hair."
"Sweetheart, are you all right?" said my grandmother, looking rather worried and concerned for my welfare. She felt my forehead. "You're quite hot, love. You're not coming down with a cold, are you? I'd never hear the end of it from your mother if you got sick. Sometimes when you have a fever, you know, your mind can play tricks on you. You can hallucinate, I believe. I've done it myself, you know."
"Grammy, I saw a ghost. I promise you I saw a ghost. You do believe me, don't you? You've just said you believe in ghosts."
"Well, sweetheart, it's a little hard to digest. How can you be sure you saw one?"
"Because, Grammy, he disappeared in front of my face. No human being can do that if they're solid like you and me. But this man, he faded before my eyes. Along the footpath in the grove, he vanished. I saw him close up, Grammy. I even saw the freckles on his nose. I ran after him. I know he saw me. He looked right into my eyes. His eyes were as blue as Gramps' are. But he never said anything to me, Grammy. Not a single word. Can you believe it? It was so weird, but I wasn't at all scared. People always say that ghosts are very scary, but he wasn't scary at all. I mean, if I saw him again, I would go after him and I'd ask him what he's doing on Gramps' land and what he's looking for, because he seems to be looking for something."
"And you're sure you saw this man?" asked my grandmother, looking rather sceptical.
"Of course I'm sure, Grammy. Why would I make this up? You know I don't tell lies."
"Well, you've got me, love. You really have. I honestly don't know what to say about this. I mean, I know very little about ghosts, and this is a first that I've heard about this before. And what about this hairy man you claim to have seen? Who is he?"
"I don't know who he is, but I know he lives in the woods. He's covered in hair, dark brown hair. He laughs all the time, and he's very sweet and big, very, very big. If you didn't know he was nice, you might be scared of him because of his size."
"Are you sure you're all right, love?" said my grandmother, thinking that I'd clearly lost my marbles. I could see that she was taking everything I was telling her with a pinch of salt, as if she was not entirely sure whether to believe my wild, preposterous claims or not. But my grandmother did know one thing about me, that I might have wanted to become a storyteller, an author one day, but I was certainly not in the habit of making up stuff that wasn't true. A while later, when my grandfather returned home from fishing at the creek, he had 6 fish in his hands, which he presented to my grandmother. He had an accomplished expression on his face, like that of a man who's had a satisfactory fishing trip.
"So you didn't come back, love?"
he teased, looking up at me with a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. He waved a finger at me.
"You didn't want to continue fishing, did you? Because they weren't biting at your line. So you decided to abandon your grandfather. Is that right, Missy? I wish you wouldn't be so defeatist, love."
"Well, that's not the reason I didn't come back to the creek to fish,"
I told him. My grandfather looked from me to my grandmother.
"What's going on here? The two of you. You look a little shell-shocked, rather bemused. Has something happened?"
"In a manner of speaking, love, Missy here is convinced she's seen a ghost in the wood grove, and a hairy man, whom she believes lives there."
"You think you've seen a ghost, Missy? Where was this Missy?"
asked my grandfather, who looked more intrigued than cynical.
"In the woods, Gramps. I saw him before. Remember that time I asked you how you had stepped ahead of the path and you didn't know what I was talking about?"
"Ah, yes, I do remember that. I thought you were confused by a trick of the light or something."
"Well, I thought that at the time. But the man that I saw is actually a ghost.
And I thought he was you because he was wearing a red plaid shirt or jacket, exactly like your one. But today when I gave him more attention, because I left the fishing with you, and I wanted to stretch my legs, that was when I saw him. And I noticed his white hair was not white like yours is, but blonde. And he's a lot younger than you are, Gramps. He doesn't walk with a limp like you do either. It was strange. He kept scanning the ground intently, as if he was looking for something, rather like a gold prospector. Only he wasn't sifting through dirt to find gold nuggets, if you know what I mean. But he was obviously looking for something he'd lost. Well, that's the impression I got. Maybe he dropped something on the ground.
He looked right at her, didn't he, love? Missy said his blue eyes reminded her rather of yours. They were a piercing blue colour, weren't they, Missy?
My grandfather's face paled.
You say you saw this young man in the grove?
As clearly as I'm seeing you now, Gramps. He didn't look at all like a ghost. I thought that ghosts were see-through, you know. But he was as solid as you and me. But I knew he was a ghost because for a second I did see through him just before he faded away. Into nothing, you know what I mean? But in the beginning he was completely solid, just like you and me. And I could still see him walking along the path, even when he became see-through, until I couldn't see him any more.
And you weren't remotely scared?
No, not at all. It was in the middle of the day, and it was just very weird, that's all.
Did you get a close look at this ghost, Missy? You say he had blonde hair, was wearing a plaid shirt. How old do you think he was? I need you to think long and hard about this. It's very important.
Well, he might have been in his 20s, but I'm not particularly good with age.
Why are you so interested in Missy's ghost, my dear? Why are you so fascinated by what she's telling you? I take it you believe her. I do believe that Missy saw what she claims to have seen. You stay there, said my grandfather, holding up a hand. I'm going to show you something, Missy. I want to show you a photograph, an old photo, taken when I was a young man.
My grandfather returned with a photograph album. He pulled out an old weathered picture that was in poor focus. It was of two men standing side by side, both uncannily alike, both with similar piercing blue eyes. One of the men in the photograph was clearly my grandfather, when he was a young man, but the other man in the photograph looked identical to the man I'd seen in the woods. I stared at the photograph incredulously, looking at my Gramps through wide, questioning eyes, and pointing at the picture in bewilderment. But that's him! That's the ghost I saw in the woods! It's him! It's him! The man standing next to you in the photograph, because I know that that is you, isn't it? It's definitely him! I don't understand. Who is he?
That's a very good friend of mine, Missy. He was 21 years old when he passed away. His name was Walter Roxbury, as it happens.
So he's dead?
I'm afraid so, love. But it seems to me that you have seen his ghost. How extraordinary, said my grandmother. I can't believe I'm actually hearing all this. I mean, who would have thought? But more to the point, what is Walter's ghost doing around our wood grove? Why do you think Missy here saw him? I mean, don't ghosts stay around because they have unfinished business on the earth plane? Maybe he doesn't know he's dead, said my grandfather. Very often after a sudden, fortuitous passing, even if it happened over 100 years ago, when a person dies in this calamitous way, they don't necessarily know that they are actually dead. But that doesn't explain what he's doing wandering around our property, said my grandmother. You say he thought he was looking for something, Missy? My grandfather inquired. I nodded my head.
He was definitely searching for something, Gramps. Definitely.
There was no doubt in my mind about that.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear that. I would like to think he's at rest, said my grandfather, running a hand over his chin reflectively. It's a very long story, he said, but it makes sense that he's looking for something, especially if he doesn't know he's dead.
What is he looking for, Gramps?
I asked. I tell you what, how about you make us a cup of coffee, love? Said my grandfather to my grandmother. I'm sure Missy here would love a nice cold glass of your homemade ginger beer. Would you like it, Missy?
Yes, please.
I will tell you both the story. Believe me, it's quite some story, but I'm going to need to rest my feet, because my legs aren't going to hold me up for this one. A good story requires one to be sitting down, does it not? I can't get my head around the fact, Missy, that you saw Walter's ghost in the woods. This is a blast from the past, let me tell you.
Before long we were sitting around the long walnut kitchen table, my grandparents drinking coffee, while I enjoyed a glass of my grandmother's homemade, very refreshing but tangy ginger beer that made my taste buds tingle. My grandfather picked up the photograph of his old friend Walter, studying it for a long time, while with a wistful, far-away, nostalgic look on his face, I noticed a tear slip down his cheeks, landing on the top collar of his shirt. I watched the tear in abject fascination. I'd never seen my grandfather cry, so I knew that whoever this Walter was, he must have meant a great deal to him. My grandfather wrapped one of his weathered-looking hands around the coffee cup, as if to hug his fingers in the warmth it provided, even though it wasn't a cold day. He paused for a moment to reflect.
Go on, love,
said my grandmother eagerly.
Tell us all about your friend Walter. Don't keep us in suspense. We want to know everything.
Well, said my grandfather, growing up I had 3 brothers, you know, 4 sisters. There were many of us cooped together in our tiny little mountain home. It didn't have enough space to swing a cat. And when I say that, I am not exaggerating. If you saw how tiny the place was where I grew up, you would be horrified. It really was tiny. We lived in very cramped conditions, but my mother kept our home as clean as a whistle. We were a very close, loving family. I mean, you had to be, didn't you? Living on top of each other like that, sharing one bed between all 9 of us, which meant on alternative nights we might occasionally sleep on the floor. We took it in turns to sleep in the bed, you see. Sleeping on the bed was a luxury.
That's terrible! It must have been horrible and so hard to sleep on the floor.
Well, it wasn't really that bad, love. You get used to living like that, you know. When you don't know any different, it's pretty normal for you. Surprisingly enough, sleeping on the floor made me much more nimble on my feet. The body likes it when you sleep on the floor, because it puts pressure on your body. A pressure that your bed will never give you. The body likes it, but you soon learn to adjust.
Well, I wouldn't like it,
I said, pulling a disgusted face.
I think it's horrible to sleep on the floor. You must have been really poor to live like that.
We were poor, Missy. Times were very tough. We really did live in an impoverished life. Yet I will tell you this, Missy. On the outside our lives were poor, but on the inside I always felt incredibly rich.
What's that supposed to mean? How can you feel rich if you're poor? That makes no sense at all.
What your grandfather is trying to tell you, Missy, is that he may have lived in a very poor family, where he never had very much materially, but his life was full, and he was very happy. So inside he felt rich, even if the outside didn't reflect how he felt on the inside. There are many wealthy people, Missy, in this world, you know. They have absolutely anything that money can buy for them, but inside they feel impoverished, because they are like a beautiful jar
that contains absolutely nothing. They're empty on the inside, you see. Their lives are vacuously hollow, meaningless. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
I think I do. Mum says at the dental surgery where she works as a receptionist, they have a very rich client. Her name's Mrs. Moderman. She drives to the surgery. Well, she doesn't drive. She's driven to the surgery in a Rolls Royce by her driver for all her appointments. Mummy says she's very miserable. She says she's never met anybody like that in her entire life. She's always complaining about everything. But they say that she's one of the richest ladies in the whole of New York. She's practically royalty. But Mum says she's very unhappy. She never ever smiles, and she looks like someone told her that her husband's been run over by a bus. That's what Mummy says. Mrs. Moderman invited my mother to a party at her very flashy residence. My mother said that every wealthy businessman in the whole of New York was at the party, and they looked bored and very miserable. The lot of them. Mum said even though they left the party in the fanciest, flashiest cars she'd ever seen in her whole life, she said she felt sorry for them all, because none of them looked at all happy.
Well, there you go, then. It proves my point, Missy. You can be rich, can't you, and feel poor. Go on with your story, love, said my grandmother, giving my grandfather an encouraging nod.
Well, what your grandmother is trying to tell you, Missy, is that being wealthy is not always being rich on the inside. But you can be wealthy, have a lot of money, and be incredibly fulfilled with your life. Your grandmother is not trying to tell you that being wealthy is a bad thing. It can be a very good thing. And it's wonderful to be prosperous on the outside and on the inside. But some of us may be poor on the outside and rich on the inside. Others rich on the outside and poor on the inside. But what you really want is a happy balance. Because being prosperous and fulfilled, both on the inside and the outside, is what every man should be. Do you understand, Missy? That is exactly what God would want for every one of us.
Yes, I understand, Gramps.
Oh, please, won't you go on with this story of yours? You're keeping us on tenterhooks, love.
I will if you will stop interrupting me. Let's see. Where was I? Ah, yes. Walter was my very best friend, even though he was not a brother of mine, but he was closer to me than any of my siblings were. Growing up, we were practically inseparable. Much like myself, he also came from a poor background. His parents often struggled to feed the family, but somehow they always managed. Both my parents had fixed opinions about life, never dared to dream big for themselves. My mother's favourite words were, "I know my place." I remember when I drew a picture of this very house that we're sitting in right now, even as I speak. I told my family I was going to build this place, live in it one day, on a large piece of Farmer Eldon's land. My mother practically scolded me for having such absurd, far-fetched ideas above my station.
Goodness gracious, Cole, you're such a fanciful child, honestly. I hate to tell you, love, but you're never going to live in a house like that. It's a pipe dream. You must face the fact that our kind, well, good fortune never happens to simple folk like us.
But why not? I asked.
Because, love, poor folk don't live like the other half of society do. We work hard for a living, don't we? With blood, sweat and tears, and it's not easy. We'll never ever make the kind of money to support a luxurious lifestyle. It's impossible. We don't have the privileges of richer folk. And we need to accept that our lives will never ever be easy. We all love each other, don't we? And as far as I'm concerned, that's what really matters.
Your mother's right, Cole. You need to be realistic, son. my father would say. Don't delude yourself into dreaming big over your life. You'll end up becoming very, very disheartened, feeling very crushed, when all your aspirations turn into smoke. And I don't want you being bitterly disappointed, son. People like us, we work hard for every single penny. And I'm sorry to say, but that's the way it is.
I don't care what you say, I stubbornly insisted. One day Farmer Eldon will give me a large piece of his big ranch, and I'll build a beautiful large house on it. I'll raise a family. I'll start up my own business and build houses for a living, like the one I've drawn on this very same piece of paper.
My mother rolled her eyes at the back of her head in exasperation, as if to say, what is this one like? My father returned her very cynical look. It was almost as if he was saying, goodness gracious me, this son of ours is completely delusional. I was constantly persuaded by my mother that I needed to accept that people like us, from very simplistic, humble origins, were never meant to be wealthy, as we came from the wrong side of the track, so to speak, even though in America at the time we weren't supposed to have a class distinction. But back in the day, no matter what they may tell you, we definitely did. There is no doubt about it in my mind. This, of course, was my parents' warped mindset. My brothers and sisters were equally as sceptical and scathing, actually laughing at me for my fancies, when I suggested one day Farmer Eldon himself would give me a large chunk of his land. As for them, not only was the idea implausible, but absolutely ludicrous.
What's wrong with you, Cole? People like us will never ever be rich,
I was told over and over again. But my best friend Walter, now he believed in my dreams. When I showed him the pictures I'd drawn up of this very house I'm living in now with you, he'd say,
I know Farmer Eldon will give you a chunk of his ranch. I know it, and then you can build a fantastic dream home on it. It will happen for you. How do you know?
I would ask him, very happy to have a friend who actually believed that my dreams were possible.
Because you believe it will happen. And if you do believe, anything is possible, because my mother says the Bible says that.
I do remember when I went to see Farmer Eldon himself. He took one long look at me, and he actually laughed out loud. Ha, 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 when I told him that I wanted to work for him, in return for a chunk of his land. The man himself thought my idea was ridiculous. I'll never forget his amused face. At the time he had very strong, strapping men working for him, and they were enviably strong. I mean, I was so puny by contrast, I have to admit. And they were working on his property for him. So why on earth would he want me? But I'll tell you this, I wasn't remotely discouraged or put out. You're a tiny runt of a thing, he told me. You'll never amount to much, son. But I tell you what, if you fancy showing me what you can do around the place, be my guest. Who am I to stop you? But I hate to say this, son. My guess is by the time the day is over, you'll be begging me to go home. There's a lot of work to be done around this place, back-breaking stuff, let me tell you. I've had full-grown men begging me to reduce their workload, so I don't hold out much hope for you staying here very long.
I'm going to surprise you,
I told him. I've got to hand it to you, son. You've got balls, I'll give you that. Well, let me tell you, I made myself indispensable to Farmer Eldon. He began to rely on me in a way he could not rely on some of his most trusted workers. Finally, he agreed to give me a chunk of his property, on the condition I worked for him free of charge for 10 years. It wasn't any skin off his nose. The large piece of land that I wanted was pretty redundant for his steers. The land itself was hilly and heavily wooded. He could easily let that part go. By the time that Farmer Eldon gave me the land that he had promised me, I was not only indispensable, but I had become a son to him, so that in the end he was practically begging me to take the land as a gift. He wanted me to have it. My parents never believed it would ever happen, and when it did, I taught them all a very invaluable lesson, that if you dream big enough, nothing is impossible for you. I lifted that family of mine out of poverty. But let's get back to the story of Walter, shall we? When I was about 18 years old, I asked Farmer Eldon to hire Walter to help manage the ranch with me. At that stage of the game, I was practically running his ranch single-handedly, with an enviable efficiency that stunned the Eldons, who were grateful for my input, because they were getting on in years by then. Whenever I asked Farmer Eldon to do something, he would usually oblige my request. He trusted my opinions on things, you know. Farmer Eldon agreed to hire Walter, and pay him quite handsomely. I had in mind that Walter could take over from me in running the ranch when I started up my own little business and built my own home. Walter fell hard for Farmer Eldon's daughter Marilyn. She was a beautiful young girl, bashful, demure. But the first day she laid eyes on Walter, there were fireworks between the two of them. I remember thinking to myself, what have I done here, bringing these two together? The Eldons are not going to like this one little bit. Ostensibly, in the beginning, Farmer Eldon actively discouraged the relationship between his daughter and Walter, which I think he deemed as inappropriate. But when he saw what a fine man Walter actually was, and observed how much Marilyn loved him, he realized Walter would be an asset to the family, and would do a great job in the efficient running of the ranch. In the end, he looked on Walter as a son. One day Farmer Eldon's wife told Walter she wanted to see him in private about a very personal matter. Walter became quite nervous about this little rendezvous with her. He was concerned that she looked down on his relationship with her daughter. But there was a great shift taking place in America back then, about 10 years after World War II. There was a less obvious class divide. America was fast becoming the land of the free. You were seeing it all over the world, people marrying into higher classes, which would never have happened before the war. Never. "You love my daughter, don't you, Walter?" she said to my friend. Walter told her, "I love her more than life itself, ma'am." "Well, then you need to do the right thing by her, don't you, Walter?" she said. "You mean marry her? You want me to marry your daughter, ma'am?" Farmer Eldon's wife nodded. "Don't look so shocked, Walter," she laughed. "I know exactly what you're thinking. But things in America are different these days, you know. Common folk are marrying people from well-to-do backgrounds all the time. You hear of countesses marrying the doormen. It's a free world now, Walter, and we should grab it with both hands. Besides anything else, you're very good for Marilyn, and since you've come along, she has blossomed so much. She's always been such a shy little thing, but you brought her out of her shell, and as a mother, I want the very best for my girl. We had her very late in life, you know. I was 48 years old when she was born. I want a good man to take care of her when I'm gone, and you do very nicely, Walter." "I would love nothing better than to marry your daughter, Mrs. Eldon. But I want to do the right thing by her before I can propose to her. I need to save up for a diamond ring." "Please don't call me Mrs. Eldon, Walter. It's really not necessary now. You're practically family. I would prefer it if you called me by my first name, Catherine. As for the ring, I've thought of the very thing. Now you wait over there." Moments later, Farmer Eldon's wife returned, with a little box in her hand, which she opened and presented to my friend. It was a beautiful sapphire and diamond engagement ring. "I can't possibly take this, ma'am," he said. "This must be very precious to you." "It is precious to me, but of course you can take it, Walter. You're like a son to me now. My daughter Marilyn is head over heels in love with you, and honestly, you belong together. I know you will be a fabulous husband to her, and I couldn't ask for any more. Besides, my husband loves you very much, and I know he will be very happy to leave the ranch in your judicious charge one day, when it becomes too much for him. This ring belonged to my grandmother, you know, and I would like you very much to have it. You can give it to my daughter. But first of all, I need you to ask my husband for my daughter's hand in marriage. He doesn't know about any of this. I want it to come from you. I may have more modern views about many things these days, Walter, but I do like marriage proposals to be orchestrated in the old-fashioned way. Now you can keep the ring, but I need to keep the box. You'll have to go to town and buy a special box for it before you present it to my daughter." As you can imagine, Walter thought all his Christmases had come at once. The Eldons were asking him to marry their daughter. Well, Mrs. Eldon was. And there was nothing he wanted more in the entire world. At the time, I was building this house on this very property. And what was the first thing Walter did after his little rendezvous with Mrs. Eldon? He put the sapphire and diamond engagement ring in the pocket of his red plaid shirt. He dropped everything he was doing and ran across Farmer Eldon's ranch to this part of the property, which is now my land, where I was building this very house. He wanted to tell me his great news. I was his best friend, after all. We told each other everything. I'll never forget that day in a hurry. Me and my brothers were building this house very industriously. All hands were on deck at the time. Even my father was lending a hand. Walter came bursting through the trees, wearing his red plaid jacket, his blonde hair frolicking wildly around his face. But there was something about his eyes that morning. They were turquoise almost in colour. They were shining with so much joy. I knew at once, with just one glance of that animated face of his, that he was bursting to tell me some great news. I could never have envisaged what he was about to tell me. By the time he reached me, he was completely out of breath. And Walter was a super-fit young man, strong as an ox he was, so he must have run like a cheetah to tell me this news that day. And boy, did he have something to tell me. "What is it, Walter?" I asked, chuckling. "What's up with you, bro? You look like you've dropped a penny and found three." I waited for his fast breathing to subside. He said to me, Go, look at me. You're never going to believe it. Marilyn's mother has practically begged me to marry her daughter." "What?" I said. "What, are you being serious?" "Perfectly serious. I thought you was going to tell me to stay away from Marilyn, that I'd never ever be good enough for her daughter. Instead, she told me that things were changing here in America, and that it wasn't uncommon for more common folk to marry the well-to-do. She gave me her blessing to marry Marilyn. Can you believe that, Cole? She told me that I made her daughter very happy, and that was all she cared about. She also believes I would manage the ranch very well." I slapped Walter on the back. "Why are you surprised, Walter? Don't sell yourself short. The Eldons love you. They know you will be great for their daughter." I couldn't believe she was giving me her blessing, bro. She told me, "Go and ask Farmer Eldon if you can marry Marilyn." And you know what he said to me, Cole? "No, what did he say?" I asked. "My guess he was as pleased as Punch. He knows you'll be an asset to running the ranch and taking care of his daughter. I'm sure he was terribly pleased. He said nothing would give me greater pleasure than to have you as a son-in-law, Walter. Can you believe that, Cole? I couldn't believe it myself. That's brilliant news, Walter, I said once again, slapping him on the back. I'm very happy for you. Marilyn loves the bones of you. I hope you've already popped the question to her, now that you've got Farmer Eldon's permission. Of course I haven't, said Walter, smiling at me bashfully. I came to tell you the good news first. You're my best friend, after all, and I always run things by you first. Besides, I want to make the proposal very special. I was hoping you could give me some ideas about what to do when I ask Marilyn to be my wife. You're very good at thinking out of the box, Walter. I want Marilyn to remember this proposal in the years to come, so it's something she can tell our grandchildren about. I want to do something wildly romantic, but at the same time rather quirky, if you know what I mean. I pulled a face. You've got me there, Walter. I'll have to think of something for you. I remember my brother Reuben was hammering nails into the wooden decking. He looked up and smiled warmly at Walter, as he'd overheard our conversation. Well, it seems congratulations are in order, Walter. But aren't you forgetting something big? You're going to need a diamond engagement ring to ask for Marilyn's hand in marriage. I'm sure a girl like her is going to expect something rather special that'll set you back a pretty penny. The Eldons are a wealthy family. You can't buy her a cheap trinket from a second-hand store. So what are you going to do? Don't listen to Reuben, I teased. He's always got to put a spanner in the works. I'm sure that Marilyn will be happy with any ring you buy her. Oh, that's sorted, said Walter, grinning from ear to ear and digging hastily into his pockets. Where the hell is it? He said, an expression of alarm developing on his face. Where the hell is it? Where is it? What are you looking for? Asked Reuben. Your face has gone all white. Oh, my goodness, gasped Walter. There's a bloody hole in my pocket. Look at this. Can you believe it? I must have dropped it. How the hell am I going to find it? Walter began to panic. He ran his hands through his blonde hair in exasperation, and his eyes were exceedingly troubled. Whatever is the matter, Walter? I asked him. Mrs. Eldon gave me a diamond engagement ring to give to Marilyn. It belonged to her grandmother. She said I needed to give it to her daughter when I asked her for her hand in marriage. I must have dropped it somewhere in the grove. I was running here to tell you the good news. I think it must have fallen through the hole in my pocket. What the hell am I going to do? What is Mrs. Eldon going to think if she knows I've lost her precious, very valuable ring? How could I be so damn stupid? What the hell is wrong with me? She told me to put it away safely, to find a pretty box for it. And I put it in the pocket of my plaid jacket, and it's got a hole in it. I've only gone and lost it. I'm such an idiot. Are you insane, Walter? I said. Why would you even consider putting an expensive engagement ring in your pocket? Why on earth did you not put the ring in a box, like Mrs. Eldon suggested you do? Or ask her to keep it for you until you found a box, for goodness sake? That would be the logical, very sensible thing to do. What were you thinking, bro? I clearly wasn't thinking. That's the problem. I was so excited about asking Marilyn to be my wife that I just didn't think about what I was doing. What the hell is wrong with me? I'm sorry to say this, Walter, but that diamond engagement ring could be anywhere around here, said Reuben. Look at the place. Rocks, trees, stones, foliage, grass. It could slip behind a blade of grass for all you know. Your chances of finding it are pretty slim, to downright close to impossible. I don't mean to go out on a tangent about this, or to make you feel worse than you already do. But what induced you, Walter, to put a valuable diamond ring loose in your pocket? I can't imagine how Mrs. Eldon is going to feel that you've lost her precious, very valuable ring. It's not exactly a good omen, is it? Nor is it an auspicious start for marrying her daughter. I wouldn't want to be wearing your boots when you have to tell her that you've lost her grandmother's ring. That's not going to go down very well." "Don't be so unkind, Reuben," I interjected. "These things happen. We all make mistakes from time to time, and if the worst comes to the worst, we can use Mr. Finley's metal detector. I do happen to know he owns one. That man has many oddities. I know he uses it to find old coins and mementos from the Civil War. I'm sure we could borrow it from him. He's a jolly good sport, and will gladly lend a hand to help us find the ring." "How could I have been so stupid?" said Walter, letting out a wail. "How am I ever going to find that beautiful ring? Supposing I don't, what will Mrs. Eldon think of me? Reuben's right, Cole. This is not looking good for me. Maybe after this unfortunate state of affairs, she'll be practically begging me not to marry her daughter. You know that's not going to happen, bro. The Eldons love you. Granted, they're not going to be impressed with you for losing a family heirloom, but there are worse things that can happen for people. I'm sure they care more about you making their daughter happy. But if you don't find the ring, you will have to buy another one. That means it's going to be a long time before I can marry Marilyn. I can't possibly propose without a ring, can I?" said Walter, looking rather mortified. "Calm down," I said. "We will retrace your footsteps, and then I'm sure we will find it. And failing that, we'll get hold of Mr. Finley's metal detector. All is not lost yet. We might be lucky. Maybe the ring will be easy to spot. But what if your brother Reuben is right? What if it slipped into the soil? Then I will never ever find it. I told you, don't get discouraged. We will borrow Mr. Finley's metal detector. Those things can work miracles, you know. Not all hope is lost yet." I persuaded all my brothers to stop what we were doing at once, on the building project. We began to frantically search through the grove of trees and along the meadow, retracing Walter's footsteps for that diamond engagement ring. I must admit, I couldn't believe Walter had been foolish enough to put the ring in his pocket. It really was bad luck that there was a hole in his pocket. In truth, I didn't feel good about finding the ring, because it could be anywhere. And furthermore, if we did use Mr. Finley's metal detector, the chances of recovering the ring were still pretty remote. But I didn't want to discourage my friend, or make him feel worse about things than he already did. Nor did I want to rub salt into the wound. We began to search high and low for the diamond ring, but it really was like looking for a needle in a haystack. And as our attempts to locate the ring kept failing, Walter became incessantly more desperate. He began frantically searching, looking behind shrubbery, bending back grass to look in between the blades, hoping to find the ring. And then something happened that we never ever saw coming. In Walter's desperate attempts to find the ring, he succeeded in antagonizing a copperhead snake while bending down in the grass to look for it. Before he could get away in time, Walter had been struck by the snake on the cheek and bitten. As old as you think I am, Missy, I'm very glad to tell you that in the 1950s we did have anti-venom. The first anti-venom was actually developed against the cobra in 1895 by a renowned scientist called Albert Calmet. So there was anti-venom available for a copperhead bite, if you got treatment in 20 hours. Failing that, you would surely die. But we knew we would get Walter help in time. Well, that's what we assumed anyway. Walter grabbed his cheek. His eyes grew wide. The copperhead snake scuttled away. "I've been bitten, bro. Did you see that?" he said. "I've been bitten." "Just calm down. We'll get you to a hospital and they'll pump you with anti-venom," I assured him. The trouble was Walter had a bad reaction to the copperhead snake bite. Almost like an anaphylactic shock, if you like. but the position of the snake bite was very disadvantageous. His whole face swelled up, his airways were blocked, he couldn't breathe, and this was happening very fast. I'd never seen anything like it before. And I hasten to say, by the time the medics arrived on the scene to take him to hospital, it was too late. We were beyond saving him. His body reacted so adversely to the venom, far too quickly, so that we couldn't get him help in time. I did, of course, try to open an airway by cutting open an area on his neck, but nothing worked. He was dead. I stared at my grandfather incredulously.
So Walter died on the property while looking for a diamond ring. Do you think he's still looking for the ring now, Gramps? Not realizing he's dead?
It's a very strong possibility, said my grandfather. On the day he died, he was wearing his red plaid shirt or jacket, if you like.
But what happened to Marilyn when she discovered that her beloved had died?
I asked. Marilyn was absolutely devastated. A year later, I hate to tell you this, but she was found drowned in the family pond. She had tied bricks to her feet. She said she couldn't go on without her, Walter.
She killed herself? Are you being serious? It's like a Greek tragedy, isn't it? You can't even make this stuff up. That is the saddest thing I've ever heard. It's sadder than Romeo and Juliet. What about the ring? Did the Eldon family ever recover the missing diamond ring?
I asked my grandfather. No, unfortunately the diamond and sapphire engagement ring was never ever found. Actually, Mrs. Eldon wasn't upset about the diamond ring being lost. She was far more devastated to have lost her future son-in-law-to-be. The irony is that Walter, had he not been frantically searching for the diamond ring, he'd have never been struck by a copperhead. It was like a bizarre set of idiosyncratic unfortunate circumstances that conspired to take down poor Walter's life. The Eldons were very broken up after that event. They sold up the ranch and moved away. They were never the same again, and didn't live long after the demise of their daughter.
Oh, how tragic! What an extraordinary story,
said my grandmother, mopping away a few tears from her eyes.
It's so sad, very, very sad. To think that Walter's ghost is probably still searching for that diamond and sapphire engagement ring to give to his beloved. He knows he needs that diamond ring to propose to her. Oh dear, oh dear. That's why Missy saw him, isn't it? He hasn't crossed over to the other side. What a devastating chain of events. Missy was telling me there's a hairy man in the grove as well. He was laughing at her because she was chasing a ghost. Isn't that right, Missy dear? Yes, it's right. There was a hairy man in the grove laughing at me, Gramps.
You've seen the hairy man? He asked. Well, I never. You must be special, Missy, for a wild man to show himself to you. They've been sighted all over this property over the years. At first, when I heard about these things, I thought it was a tall, fictitious story, until one day I saw a wild man myself. Mr. Eldon would tell me that these things were real, but I never believed it for a moment. I was about 19 years old at the time, working on the Eldons' property. One of my jobs was to clean out the stable block. We had a white mare called Silver Birch, who had never been the same after losing her foal to a stillbirth. I had watched her deliver that foal myself, with Farmer Eldon at my side, trying to resuscitate her dead foal. It was born dead. It was heartbreaking for the mare. In the end, we quickly removed the foal from the mother as discreetly as we could. Most horses, and even animals alike, tend to bounce back from a tragedy like that. But Silver Birch was a sensitive soul. She was never quite the same after losing her foal. Before she had been an easy-going, happy-go-lucky horse, but after the stillbirth she became very anxious. We had a breeding stallion on the property, but we kept Silver Birch well away from him, deciding we didn't want her to be impregnated again, because if she lost a second foal, it wouldn't be good for her mental well-being. I would regularly visit Silver Birch to give her special attention. She had become quite temperamental and rather highly strung, after losing her foal, months after the event, I have to say. It was late one afternoon, when I paid Silver Birch a visit. I liked her very much. She was vulnerable, so I had an inclination to be rather protective towards her. It was growing dark, and I heard the soft chanting sound as I entered Silver Birch's stable. I remember thinking to myself, what the hell is that? I'd never heard a sound like that before. It was soothing. When I entered her stable block, I noticed that Silver Birch seemed incredibly calm, but the chanting stopped almost at once as I made my approach, and that was when I first saw a wild man. He had his arms right around Silver Birch, his face nuzzling into her neck. He looked rather alarmed when he saw me, and hurriedly bolted out of the stable, faster than you could say Jack Robinson. But he'd been there long enough for me to get a jolly good look at him. He must have been about 10 foot tall, I suspect. Very intimidating to look at. I will say this. After he visited the mare, Silver Birch calmed down significantly. His chanting appeared to have healed her. The hairy man performed miracles on her, and one day when she was in season, I discovered she was missing from her stable block. It was in the middle of the night. I'd been having dinner with the Eldons and decided to check up on my favourite mare. Imagine my shock when I discovered Silver Birch was missing from her stable. I didn't panic, of course, but I went to search for her. I found her cavorting with the male stallion in his very cushy enclosure. My first thought was, how the hell did Silver Birch get in here? And my second thought was, she's definitely been impregnated. The male stallion looked reasonably satisfied with himself, like the cat who'd got the cream. I was stunned. I didn't know how this had happened. Farmer Eldon would not be best pleased. He didn't want Silver Birch to be pregnant again. And then I saw him. I knew at once who'd brought the horses together. It was the wild man. I realized the wild man had taken Silver Birch to the stallion's enclosure in the middle of the night. We locked eyes together, and I heard a voice in my head. She needs a new foal. I brought them together. This will be good for her spirit. She needs to be a mother again. She needs to feel needed. The hairy man then bolted away from the enclosure, and when he'd glided away, he looked at me over his shoulders, and I knew in that quintessential moment the wild man knew exactly what he was doing. He understood the language of the natural world in ways we could never imagine. So Silver Birch did become pregnant. She gave birth to a beautiful foal, and once again she became the fun-loving, easy-going horse we'd always remembered. She was back to being her old self again. I never told Farmer Eldon about the wild man's intervention. He simply thought I was the one who had gone against his wishes and got Silver Birch impregnated. He slapped me on the back in congratulations. Well done for not listening to me, Cole. You understand that horse far better than I do. She certainly needed this foal. She's a transformed character thanks to you.
Wow, that's incredible, Gramps. So the wild man helped Silver Birch?
Yes, he did indeed. He understood the mare. He knew exactly what she needed. He could speak the language of horses.
After my grandfather's amazing story, I was confident that I would see the ghost in the red plaid shirt again, and the wild man. But the weirdest thing of all is I actually never did, even though I continued to visit my grandparents for every single holiday, and I was so disappointed not to see them. I began to hope that the ghost in the red plaid shirt had found his peace and crossed over to the other side. Of course, I did not realize that even after my own grandfather's death, that this story had not come to its completion yet, but I would bring the final chapter to a close in ways I never envisaged possible, and that maybe my encounter with the ghost in the red-plaid shirt and the hairy man himself had not come to a fortuitous end after all.
About 30 years later, at this point in my life, yes, you've guessed right, my grandparents had long since died. My beloved grandfather, against my father's wishes, who had inspired my writing career, had left his house in the Blue Ridge Mountains to me. My father would naturally have liked me to have sold the place, but I ended up renting it out to holiday makers that visited the area. It made for me a nice tidy income that helped support my writing career, that at this point in time was going nowhere. It hadn't remotely taken off. I was in my 40s and had 4 failed books behind me that had been rejected by publishers. So I was in a fragile state of mind, wondering why I'd put so much time and effort into my stories, only to have no thank you letters sent to me from various publishers all over the place. Of course, my parents were incredibly frustrated with me. I was their only daughter, unmarried and without any children of my own, going down the dreadful life path that they had warned me about. And yes, it had been a lonely one, and in a manner of speaking, I was probably living a hermetic existence, shutting the world out in order to focus on my writing. But the truth was that even if I wanted to do something else with my life, it would have been close to impossible, because my hunger to write was insatiable. I had my grandfather to thank for an income that enabled me to pursue my passion, so that I could rent an apartment in New York and support my humble lifestyle by receiving rent for his house. My grandfather had also given me money in a trust fund, because he knew I would likely need it, so I could focus on my writing without having to support myself like an aspiring actress would, who waitresses tables for a living.
Honestly, love, I warned you about all this, my mother said, looking at me warily when we were having coffee together at a coffee shop in town. And my mother had chosen this quintessential moment to express her grievances to me about the path I had chosen to take for my life. You're a very good-looking young lady, dear, but looks don't last forever, and you don't want to be left on the shelf, do you? You're in your 40s, Missy, for goodness sake. I do hate to say this, love, but you really aren't getting any younger. What's that supposed to mean, Mum? Well, don't you want to get married, love, and have a child, for goodness sake? There is nothing more satisfying in the entire world than being a mother. And I speak from experience because I've been one to you. And this is coming from you, is it? I said sarcastically, rolling my eyes in the back of my head, as if to say, I've heard everything now. If I remember correctly, you and Dad love nothing better than jaunting all over the globe, leaving me to stay with my grandparents. I don't believe for a second you ever planned to have children. You've never admitted that much to me, but I can read between the lines. I believe I was a mistake. You definitely wanted to devote your lives to travel. That's why you and Dad worked so hard, so that you could get away and travel to all those exciting places. And I'm not judgmental about that at all. I think it's great you did what you did. Well, that's because, love, we enjoyed travelling so much. But it didn't mean for a second that we didn't love being parents to you. We loved the bones of you, we did. And you know very well that that is true. Yes, we never expected to have a child, but when you came along, you were the very best thing that happened to us. You were far more important to us than travelling all around the world. Your grandparents taking care of you. Well, that was a wonderful thing for them to do. So we had the best of both worlds, didn't we? Because believe it or not, Missy, I really loved being a mother to you. And I don't believe I was a bad mother either. You didn't resent me sending you to your grandparents, did you? No, of course I didn't. Staying with my grandparents was a gift, and yes, you were a fabulous mother. But that doesn't mean that I want to follow your example. But why not, love? There is nothing more satisfying than being a mother. You're in your 40s now, for goodness sake. If you leave it too long, you might not be able to have children. I mean, have you stopped to think about that for a moment, Missy, dear? I don't believe you have. Your biological clock is ticking even as I speak, and I do hope you realize that. Me and your father, well, I don't know how to say this to you, love, without appearing incredibly rude, but we are worried. Your father would love to have grandchildren.
I want to focus on my writing career, Mum. I thought I made that very clear to you and Dad.
And where has that got you? Said my mother, snapping. You've wasted so much time writing those 4 books, and all for what? They've been rejected one by various publishers. Should that not be telling you something? That you're travelling down a road that is leading to absolutely nowhere. Your father warned you about this, love, throughout your childhood, but you simply refused to listen to his guidance and wisdom. Your father was looking out for you. He knows what it's like to be an author.
What's that supposed to mean, Mum?
Well, love, all I'm trying to say is maybe it's a good idea to take a long, hard look at yourself, to take stock. I mean, you could get a 9-to-5 job, couldn't you? Live a normal life, why don't you? Socialize, go out on a few dates, meet some interesting people. These days it's a lot easier to meet people than it was back in my day, you know. You shouldn't be alone, love. There are so many eligible bachelors out there who I am quite sure would be delighted to meet you.
You know what Gramps would say about that, Mum? If at first I don't succeed, I should try and try again. And that's how I feel about my writing career. And as for dating and socializing, I haven't got time, patience, or energy to do that. And I don't even want to be a mother.
Well, I don't believe it, said my mother, rolling her eyes in exasperation. That man is incorrigible, isn't he? I mean, he's been dead for a long time, but he's still influencing your life from beyond the grave. I blame him for all this, I really do. He put those wild, nonsensical ideas into your head when you were a little girl about becoming an author. And you lapped it all up, didn't you, like a dog with its milk? Furthermore, if it wasn't for him leaving you everything, then you wouldn't be able to finance these absurd dreams of yours, and it might have knocked some sense into you. I'm sorry, but I'm going to say this, love, and yes, it's going to hurt, but what the hell? I'm going to say it anyway. Say what, Mum? You're living in a fool's paradise, love. You're completely delusional. I don't believe you will ever be a published author, nor will you become a bestseller. It's a lottery whether you succeed or not, love, and honestly, hand on heart, I'm not sure you're going to make it, love. Life is tough out there, and we don't always get what we want, believe me. I know these things, and we want what's best for you, love, me and your father. Why don't you just get a sensible job? Focus on meeting a nice young man. You're in your 40s, but people in their 40s still can have children, you know. It's when you get to your 50s that becomes an impossibility.
The truth is, Mum, you don't give a damn about my writing career, do you? Not really. You think it's all pie in the sky, don't you? The truth is, Mum, you don't give a damn about my writing career. You think it's all pie in the sky, don't you? What you really want for me is to be married, to have 2.4 children. You want that for me, to live a normal life.
Yes, I'm not going to deny it, love. That's exactly what I want for you. I won't pussyfoot around about this anymore and tell you exactly what you want to hear. Your father was absolutely right all those years ago. I'm sorry he was, when he tried to warn you about a writing career. He told you to go into journalism, be a teacher or something like that. But no, you wouldn't listen. You know your problem, love, is that you've always been obstinately stubborn. You think you know best for your own life. Sometimes you should listen to your parents, because they also know what's good for you.
Oh, so you know what's best for me, Mum, do you?
Yes, I do, as it happens. So does your father. One day, love, when you have 100 more rejection letters behind you from various publishers, you're going to reflect on all this and say, what did I do with my life? Why did I shut myself away from society? Why did I have no children? Why didn't I get married? You're going to reflect all over this, love, and realize how desperately sad and lonely you've become. And me and your father are going to die, never having had any grandchildren of our own. It's going to be very sad all around, you know. Oh, so this is what it's really all about? You and Dad wanting grandkids? Of course we want grandchildren. But most of all, we want you to be happy, love. And you don't look remotely happy to me right now. In fact, if the truth be told, I've never seen you look more miserable in my entire life. And I blame it on all this writing. It's sucked the life right out of you, has it not? And yet you refuse to admit it. Of course I don't look happy, Mum. Are you surprised? Yesterday I had another rejection letter in the post. So of course I'm not happy. But it doesn't mean I want to give up on my writing. My writing makes me happy. I don't expect you to understand that, because you've never understood that. My mother rolled her eyes. Here we go again, love. What you don't get is that me and your father love you. We want the best for you. We're only looking out for you. In that case, Mum, will you say no more about this? I'd really appreciate it if you just shut your mouth. But, no buts, Mum. I don't want to talk about this any more. Let's agree to disagree, shall we? But, Mum, I said, raising my hand in a warning gesture, so my mother's lips opened and closed like a rather startled goldfish that almost looked pained. Mum, there is something I'm going to tell you, and you're not going to like it one bit, I'm afraid. My mother let out a large sigh. What is it now? Is this about your new book idea or something? I'm moving away, Mum. Leaving New York. You're what? You can't do that, love. This is your home. You love it here in New York. All your friends and family are here. I just think that living here in New York might not be the right creative environment for my writing. It might be stifling me a little, that's all. Oh, so you think you need to go to some exotic location to inspire you? Is that it? I think I've heard everything now, love. Don't be like that, Mum. Honestly, is it too far-fetched to believe a new idyllic environment might actually inspire me? Give me more creative ideas? So where are you going to go, love? Timbuktu, are you? No, I've decided to stop renting out Gramps' place and move in there for a while. But why would you do that, love? You like the rental income you receive from the place. Well, why wouldn't I? The Blue Ridge Mountains is where I had my best adventures growing up as a girl. I have so many beautiful memories of that place. The views are spectacular over the mountains. It'll be easy to work in such a secluded place. And I think it will inspire my creative juices. So what do you think? I suppose I shouldn't ask you that question. I'm surprised you even want my opinion, dear. Because the way I see it, you never take what I say to heart. Sometimes I feel with you, I'm just talking to a brick wall. Don't be like that, Mum. Like what? So defensive. Well, you want my opinion, love, do you? I'll give it to you straight. Moving to the Blue Ridge Mountains is a very bad idea as far as I'm concerned. So far away from me and your father and all your friends. It's a ludicrous idea. Sometimes I do wonder what goes on in that head of yours. Mum, I'm not doing anything dramatic. I'm just going to live in my grandparents' house in the Blue Ridge Mountains. What's wrong with that? I do think the environment will inspire me a lot. Lots of writers do these kind of things, you know. Well, who am I to stop you, love? I can see that anything I say to you has absolutely no persuasive influence over you whatsoever. As things panned out, moving to my grandfather's place in the Blue Ridge Mountains was one of the best decisions I have ever made, for it was here that I would write my best-selling novel, and from thenceforth my writing career would open up for me in ways I never gleaned possible. It was in the Blue Ridge Mountains that after my move I would meet my husband, and we would go on to have 2 children, so my parents would not end up feeling short-changed after all. But my grandfather would be proved right. In the end, we should always follow our hearts,
for that is the only thing that is going to give your life purpose. Growing up in New York, I had been around a great deal of people, especially wealthy people who were well-to-do. I'd even met the very wealthy, rather miserable woman, Mrs. Molman, who drove everywhere in her Rolls-Royce. She was a woman that visited the dental surgery regularly, where my mother worked as a receptionist when I was a girl. I do recall being taken one day to one of her glamorous parties. I was left to play with rich kids, and these kids who had absolutely everything that money could possibly buy. They were incredibly spoilt, would consistently say the same two words over and over again. "I'm bored! I'm bored! What do we do now?" I remember thinking, you kids have so much, and that's all you can say. In that moment I had an epiphany that changed my life. I knew I had things a whole lot better than they did. I may not have had great wealth, but I was never ever bored, because I got so much satisfaction from reading my books and writing stories. Boredom was not a word I was well acquainted with, and even as an adult I was living a very fulfilled life, although my parents never fully appreciated that. When I first arrived at my grandparents' old home in the Blue Ridge Mountains, tears trickled down my cheeks, tears of nostalgia. This I had not expected to happen, but returning back to the old place that I'd kept in pristine condition over the years, for the purposes of my rental customers, rarely felt to me like a coming of home, so to speak. I could almost smell my grandmother's baking from the kitchen, as if she was baking her world-famous lemon chiffon cake. I could almost see my grandfather bursting through the kitchen door as he rattled his fishing tackle that he carried in his arms. I could hear him say, "Nothing was biting today. Those damn fish! Why are they being so dreadfully elusive? Oh, is that lemon chiffon cake I smell? I'm beginning to feel very hungry. I'd like that served warm with some clotted cream and strawberries, if I may." "Oh, Gramps," I said, wiping a tear away, "I miss you so much. But I've come here to write, and there's a bestseller in me yet." My devoted black Labrador Sheba, who lay at my feet every day, gave me an approving woof as if to say, "This is a hell of a lot better than New York." My black Labrador was reasonably old. I'd picked her up from a shelter a year back. I'd go to the shelter asking to see the oldest, most neglected dogs, because an old dog living out its last years was the most suitable companion for a writer. Sheba would stay by my side, and where I went she would cordially follow very faithfully. I would also take her on short, brisk walks, and living out here in the Blue Ridge Mountains appeared to have given her a spring to her step. One day the most extraordinary thing happened. I'd been writing steadily at my computer for a long while. I was suddenly hit with a restless feeling, which of course is not uncommon when you're a writer. I felt frustrated with my writing, almost as if my words had reached a dead end or a cul-de-sac in the road. I knew to get that stuffy cotton wool feeling out of my ears, I needed to take a refreshing walk in the fresh air, and to be inspired by Mother Nature herself, and of course the prepossessing views over the Blue Ridge Mountains. So when I said the word walk, Sheba jumped up, thumping her tail on the floor, and together side by side we sashayed out of the house. I found myself thinking rather wistfully about my trips here as a child, where I would fish by the creek with my grandfather. The memory made me smile. As we walked through the woods, Sheba suddenly began to bark. That was when I saw a familiar flash of a red plaid shirt through the trees. My heart almost stopped its gentle rhythm. Was the ghost of Walter still haunting the grove after all these long years? Was he looking for Marilyn's engagement ring? It would seem so. Sheba continued to bark incessantly, and we both began to run after Walter's ghost. I could see him so clearly, which makes me wonder if a lot of people may have seen ghosts without being aware of it, because to look at Walter in his red plaid shirt was like any regular person you might actually see crossing the road of a busy street, or taking a casual stroll in the woods. I was definitely seeing his ghost, so I began to call after him, "Walter! Walter!" But the figure just disappeared before my very eyes, and Sheba was as confounded as I was. She looked at me through black eyes and began to whine, almost as if she was saying, "What happened there?" "He's gone," I told Sheba. So we resumed our walk, almost as if nothing had happened, although my mind was now promptly ablaze with all kinds of thoughts. I couldn't help but reflect on how ironic it was on seeing the ghost of Walter after all these long years, when I hadn't been looking for him at all, and now he'd shown up like this out of the blue. As we walked rather casually through the trees, Sheba had her nose pinned to the ground. She seemed to be excited by a scent. Before long she was running over towards a bush of leafy green foliage. She rambunctiously threw up the earth with her paws and began to vigorously dig. And that was when she pulled up what looked like a large animal bone. But as I peered at the ground, something caught my eye, something sparkling. I picked up the thing that glinted in the light. It was dusty, covered with dirt, but I was sure I knew exactly what it was, and I couldn't get home fast enough. I dashed into the house with Sheba at my side, running to the kitchen sink, and began to scrub the tiny thing in my hand. And sure enough, I'd found the diamond and sapphire engagement ring all those years later, still in perfect condition. The ring that Walter, my grandfather's friend, had lost all those years ago. I really didn't know what to do with the ring. I stared at it incredulously and said out loud, "Walter, wherever you are, I've got your engagement ring. You can come and get it. I'll put it on my nightstand, and I hope after that you can finally rest in peace." It was every morning and late afternoon, before it got dark, that I followed the same regime every day. Because when you're a writer, you live by your routines. I would spend many long hours at my computer, with Sheba lying across my feet as a foot warmer. It was late afternoon in the fall, and it was so pretty looking out from the upstairs window of my grandfather's house, over the mountains. I'm not sure what time it was, but my mother phoned me, so I answered her call. "Hi, Mum." "Hello, love. I've been thinking about you there on your own. You really should come up to New York for the weekend. Me and your father would love to see you. I'm missing you dreadfully, love. How is Sheba doing?" "Oh, she's loving it here in the mountains. It's like coming here has given her a new lease of life. You'll never believe what happened the other day. Remember that ghost story I told you about?" "Oh, you mean the ghost of Walter, the one in the red plaid shirt? Don't tell me you saw him again. I don't believe it." "I did, as it happens. It was him." "Goodness gracious me, love. That's dreadful. You don't think he's still searching the woodgrove for his beloved engagement ring? His poor soul really needs to rest. It's been long enough for him, hasn't it? I think your Gramps was right. He certainly doesn't appear to know he's dead. What happened? Did he see you?" "No, I saw him in the woods. He was as solid and real as you and me. If you had seen him, you would never have believed he was a ghost, not even for a second." "How extraordinary, love. What on earth did you do?" "Well, I called his name. I ran after him. So did Sheba. I said, 'Walter, Walter,' but he just disappeared in front of my eyes. He more or less faded away, I suppose. I think Sheba was as confounded as I was." "Oh, dear. Well, I suppose that was inevitably going to happen, wasn't it? I mean, ghosts don't exactly have a habit of sticking around, do they?" "That's not all." "It isn't?" "No. You won't believe this, Mum, but Sheba picked up a smell in the grove. She began digging up the ground. She retrieved an old bone of a dead animal. Actually, she brought it back home with her."
"Oh, please, love, I don't need to hear these grisly details. I must remind you, I'm going out with your father for dinner tonight. There's a lovely new Italian not far from where we live, which I've heard raving reviews about, and I would thank you kindly to let me eat my meal without thinking about putrid trophies that Sheba brings back home with her."
"You aren't listening, Mum. When Sheba was digging up the ground, I noticed something glinting in the soil. It was congealed with mud, but I picked it up, took it home, cleaned it up, and believe it or not, I know I found Walter's diamond and sapphire engagement ring after all these long years."
You never! Goodness gracious me! That is absolutely incredible. What were the chances of that ever happening? I don't know what to say, love. But I think you need to light a candle. Tell Walter you've got his ring, and hope he hears you. I think that ghost needs to be reunited with the ring, don't you? And then maybe he'll finally rest.
As I was talking to my mother on the phone, I suddenly observed a black shadowy form slipping through the trees. I was sure for a moment that this thing was looking my way and actually beckoning to me. Had I imagined it? Was that the hairy man that I'd seen all those years ago, chuckling at me for running after a ghost? I couldn't be sure, but I needed to find out. "I've got to go, Mum. I'm really sorry."
But why, love? The conversation has only just got interesting. This is a turn-up for the books, is it not? Finding Walter's diamond engagement ring of all things. I do want to hear more. Wait until your father hears about this. You know him. He enjoys a good story.
"Sorry, Mum. I've got to go," I said rather brusquely, cutting her off. I rocketed out of the house as fast as I could, with Sheba at my side, who was barking excitedly, as if I'd suddenly invented a brand new, wildly exciting game. Certainly my burst of adrenaline had impacted her ebullience. She seemed to forget that she had a touch of arthritis in her legs. She ran like the wind through the trees, with me eagerly following close behind her, begging her to slow down. When I entered the woodgrove, I suddenly felt incredibly foolish. Because if it was the Bigfoot that I'd encountered as a girl, that I'd seen disappearing through the trees, there was nothing to suggest that this was indeed the case, as nothing was around me, absolutely nothing, just trees and more trees. The woodgrove was completely silent. I looked around me in bewilderment, and I felt desperately silly. What was I like, following what I believed to be a dark, shadowy mass into the grove? It was probably nothing, a trick of the light perhaps, or wishful thinking on my part. Certainly over the years I'd watched endless documentaries on the subject of Bigfoot, since my own bizarre encounter, and since my grandfather's incredulous story about a Bigfoot that had been like a horse whisperer to Farmer Eldon's grey mare, who had become increasingly distressed after her first foal had been born dead. Indeed, there was an outer-worldly, transcendental ambience in the woodgrove at this moment, the likes of such that I've never felt before or since. And even as a writer by profession, I find it close to impossible to describe the preternatural celestial mood of the woods that day. It was like the woodgrove had morphed into something mystical, something magical, that would make you believe in the substance of children's fairy tales as being more real than actually fictitious. I persuaded myself that the outer-worldly impressions that I'd picked up in the woods, that gave me the very certain feeling that I was caught up on the yellow brick road, wearing a pair of sparkling red slippers, like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, had a whole lot to do with the time of day it actually was. It was the late afternoon, drifting into the early evening. The sun was setting over the horizon, in a bedazzling kaleidoscope of rather fetching salmon pinks and very ethereal golds, that had cast its gossamer light in sprinkles of scintillating glitter over the leafy green foliage that surrounded me on every side. So was it any wonder it felt so special, almost as if the whole woodgrove had become like a subtropical paradise. Sheba was behaving rather strangely as she sniffed the air, almost as if she'd picked up a rather peculiar scent on the wind that she could not fathom. All of a sudden she burst into excited barking, and she began to bark at some leafy green foliage, with her dark eyes fixed on the shrubbery. All of a sudden a curtain of foliage began to quake and quiver, and then a black hand emerged, followed by a large body, which began to reveal itself to me. It was a Bigfoot, and Sheba did not see the creature differently to any other human being, even though he was covered with hair, because she promptly bolted over to the Bigfoot, wiggling her body ebulliently and practically throwing herself at the Bigfoot, demanding to be stroked. The Bigfoot began to chuckle. He held his stomach and laughed, just as he had done when I was a child.
and I could not help but laugh myself, for his amusement was infectious. The Bigfoot's humorous eyes remained fixed on me. I knew at once I was seeing exactly the same Bigfoot I had seen as a little girl. We both recognized each other, and the Bigfoot chuckled again. "I remember you," he said to me telepathically. "Funny little thing you were. I'm glad you're back. He needs your help. He still doesn't know he's dead. They say you are the only one that can help him. They told me to give you the message." "Who told you to give me what message?" I asked. "Your grandfather told me. He told me this in spirit. He wants you to help his friend. He says his friend is lost. He tells me that you can help his friend. He says you found what he's looking for. You need to tell him. That's why I called you here." "But how could you call me?" I asked the Bigfoot. "I did. Why are you here now, then?" "Well, I thought I saw you going into the woods, that's all, but I wasn't sure it was you." "You followed me because I called you. Now he'll be here in any minute," the Bigfoot told me. Seconds later, I heard the thumping of heavy boots, and I knew it was Walter's ghost, and I immediately ran after him, calling him. "Walter! Walter! Walter!" I cried out. "Walter!" I ran after the ghostly figure, with Sheba at my side. Sheba was barking excitedly. The ghost of Walter stopped for a brief moment. He looked at me with his piercing blue eyes that reminded me of my grandfather's. "You're dead, Walter! You're dead! You've been dead for a long time! Marilyn is waiting for you on the other side. If you want the diamond ring, I've got it. It's on my nightstand." I didn't know if Walter's ghost heard what I'd said, because he looked straight ahead of me, through his piercing blue eyes, turned around and walked away. I tried to find the Bigfoot again, but he had all but gone. That night I returned to bed and read a book. I fell fast asleep, with Sheba lying on my feet. I had left Walter's diamond ring on the nightstand. I was awoken in the middle of the night by my dog's growls. I suddenly felt very certain that someone was in the room with me, and it wasn't just Sheba. But when I looked around my bedroom, it was covered in ambiguous dark shadows, with a soft moonlight filtering through the room, as I hadn't fully closed the curtains. I knew Sheba was seeing something. That was because she was whining and looking up at something that I could not physically see. But I absolutely knew someone was there. I could feel the energy. I could feel eyes watching me. And then for a brief second, like a flash of a photograph, I saw Walter standing by my bed. There was a huge smile on his face, and then he was gone. And when I looked down at my nightstand, the diamond engagement ring that Walter had been looking for so long had all but vanished. I realized that Walter's ghost must have taken the ring, and I don't even know how he did that. Sheba stopped whining, and everything became very calm, and then I drifted off into a deep sleep again, where I experienced a lucid dream that was so incredibly real. In my dream, a woman in a white dress, whom I'd never ever seen before, floated towards me. She was holding out her hand, and on her finger she was wearing Walter's diamond engagement ring. Then I saw a man floating in on the scene, taking the woman's hands. He was dressed in white. It was Walter. The scene folded away before my eyes. Then I saw a vision of my grandparents. My grandfather was smiling at me through his piercing blue eyes, and he said to me, "You go, girl, write that novel." And the very next morning, when I woke up, I did just that. It was almost as if the words bounced freely into my head. The story flowed seamlessly, and when I completed the book and sent it off to the publishers, it must have been a few weeks later when I received the confirmation from them that they wanted to publish my work, and it soon became a bestseller. So with trembling fingers, I had phoned my mother. "Yes, love, what is it?" came my mother's voice. "Mum, I'm getting published." "You're what?" I told you, I'm getting published. Can you believe that? Sorry, love. Say that again, will you? I'm getting published, Mum. You're getting published? Well, I don't know what to say, love. That's absolutely incredible. I can't believe it. I'm so happy. Wait until I tell your father about this.
That, of course, was not the only shock my mother had to endure. There were many more shocks that came her way, shocks I don't think she was prepared for, but I'm glad to say my mother had a reasonably strong constitution. Ma'am, I'm getting married. Sorry, love, what did you say? I told you, I'm getting married. You're not. Is this some kind of a joke or something? Of course it's not. Why would I make something like this up, Mum? But you're winding me up. You have to be. No, I'm not. Who is he, love? Why don't I know about this? Because it's been a bit of a whirlwind romance, Mum. I was swept off my feet, you could say. And now, love, you've swept me off mine. Who is he, love? Why don't I know about any of this? Because it's been a whirlwind romance, and I've been swept off my feet. I really, really like him, Mum, and I'm actually pregnant. You're pregnant? You're pregnant? Oh, my word! Well, you've blown me off my feet, love. I know nothing about this man of yours, but your pregnancy, I've never been more pleased in my life. I'm very looking forward to meeting him, I have to say. His name is Oliver Turnbull, Mum, and he's absolutely amazing. You're going to love him. He's everything I'm looking for in a man. Oh, goodness gracious, I don't think my heart can take this great news. You have made me and your father incredibly happy, love. I thought that we would never be grandparents. This calls for a celebration. And celebrate we did in the weeks to come, until my parents both became grandparents, and from thenceforth I never ever heard a whisper from them about my being in the wrong career. So there you are. That's my story. Well, I don't know what to say. Wasn't that the most marvellous, marvellous story? I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I look forward to you leaving your comments. But goodness gracious, I was so happy that the ghost of Walter found his peace, because they do say that ghosts are very attached to things sometimes, and that's why they can't pass over to the other side. And so obviously in her dream state, when she had that dream where Walter appeared to her with his long-lost love, it was clear they were reunited again. And the Bigfoot, oh, what a lovely Bigfoot, laughing like mad at her chasing after a ghost. What an incredibly charming story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.